Welcome back to Lullaby Atlas. Tonight, we follow the gentle story of Abraham. Close your eyes, let the world fall away. Before the story begins, let yourself arrive. The day is over now. There is nothing left to do. You are safe here. Tonight, we walk a long, gentle road with an old traveler under old stars, from a city by a great river, home at last to rest. You need only to rest. And if you like, before you drift, leave a word saying where you are listening from tonight. So many of us are resting together along these old roads. So let us begin, slowly, beside a great river, in a city called Ur. The great river moved slowly at evening, broad and dark and full of itself, carrying the last of the sunset in long gold ripples toward the south. On its banks, the city of Ur was settling into the warm blue hour between the lamp lighting and the dark, a city of flat rooftops and narrow lanes and courtyard walls, bleached pale as old bone by the long summer. The river turned a wide bend here, and the water at the bend was shot through with moonrise even before the moon itself had cleared the eastern palms. Along the reed banks, the tall papyrus grass stood perfectly still, as it does in that hour when the day wind has died and the night wind has not yet found its courage. Small herons, gray as smoke, stood at the water's edge and did not move. Moored among the reeds were the boats of the reed cutters, long narrow craft woven from the same rushes they harvested, resting now with their ropes slack, their hulls tapping softly against the bank in the slow currents passing. The river had always been here. The city had grown up drinking from it, praying toward it, reading its moods like a letter from somewhere older than memory. Behind the reed banks, the lamplit lanes of the city were beginning to glow. Mud brick walls caught the lamplight and held it amber, warm as fired clay. In the narrow streets between the tall houses, the day's commerce was winding slowly down. Potters stacking vessels in the half-dark, weavers rolling their finished cloth, merchants folding their awnings, while the last customers lingered over dried figs and pressed cakes of sesame. The smell of the evening was wood smoke and flat bread and the faint sweetness of the river mud, a smell so old in that city that it lived in the walls themselves. The rooftops were where the families went as the heat of the day released its long grip. Up there, above the maze of lanes, the air moved freely, carrying the river's breath and the first of the night's coolness. Children ran between the low parapet walls. Old men sat with their legs folded and their cups of something warm, watching the stars appear one by one above the eastern horizon. Women spread the evening's washing over the parapet edges, white cloth going blue in the fading light. The rooftops of Ur were a city above the city, open to the enormous sky. Far to the south and east, where the city gave way to open ground, the great ziggurat rose in stepped tiers against the darkening sky, a man-made mountain of fired brick and bitumen, its broad shoulders carrying the first stars on their ledges. It was old. It had always seemed old, even to the oldest people in the city, as though it had been there before the city needed a name. From the river, from the rooftops, from the far date palm groves at the edge of the irrigated fields, the ziggurat silhouette was the fixed mark of the horizon, a shadow that belonged to the sky as much as to the earth. In a courtyard not far from the river quarter, in a house of mud brick with a fig tree growing in the corner and a low stone lip around its central well, a household was gathering for the evening. This was the house of Terah, an old man of many years whose beard was white as river foam and whose eyes held the particular stillness of someone who has watched a great deal of the world go past. His household was not small. Servants, herdsmen, a son called Nahor with his family, and his son Abram, who was the quietest of them all and the one most likely to be found sitting apart, watching the sky. Abram was not a young man, though the story has not yet shown him in the full length of his age. He was a man in the later middle of his years, lean and spare in the way of men who have spent much of their lives outdoors, with hands that knew ropes and tent pegs and the coarse wool of sheep, as well as they knew the smooth clay of a water jar. His wife was Sarai, and she was lovely in the quiet way that some faces are lovely, not by arrangement of feature alone, but by some quality of the attention behind the eyes, a way of looking at the world with both steadiness and warmth. They were without child, Abram and Sarai, and the old story holds this gently, without pressing on the tenderness of it. A household without children is a household with a particular kind of quiet in the evenings, a quiet that is not empty, for they had each other and the larger family and the work of every day, but a quiet that holds a question in it, the way a cupped hand holds water, careful not to spill what is already there. The fig tree dropped a leaf into the courtyard. The lamp on the low table swayed as someone passed and steadied. The night market at the river end of the lane was winding down now, the vendors packing their last wares by torchlight, the torches themselves beginning to gutter in the small breeze that came off the water after dark. A dog trotted past the courtyard gate and paused and sniffed and moved on. Somewhere in the house, a child belonging to Nahor's family was being settled to sleep, its small voice going thin and then disappearing into the murmur of the household. The city at night was not silent. Cities never are. But its nighttime sounds were softer and more patient than its daytime ones, a lower register, a longer breath. Above the city, the sky was extraordinary. It always was, in that flat river country where no hill intervened between the eye and the full turn of the heavens. The stars came down close to the horizon in every direction, so that standing on a rooftop on a clear night in Ur was something like standing in the center of an enormous lamp. Stars to the north where the river came from, stars to the south where it went, stars above the reed marshes and above the date palms and above the stepped shadow of the ziggurat, stars in such number that they seemed to hum very faintly if you listened in exactly the right way. Abram was on the rooftop that night, as he often was. He had brought up a small clay lamp and set it on the parapet, where it made a very modest argument against the dark. He sat with his knees drawn up and his chin resting on his folded arms, in the way a man sits when he is thinking something he cannot yet put into words. The stars were very bright. The river was a long silver motion beyond the rooftops. He had lived in this city all his life, and his father before him, and his father's father before that, and yet there were evenings when felt to him like a garment that did not quite fit, not uncomfortable, not ungenerous, but somehow not quite the shape of him. He did not know, sitting there, what it was that made him restless on these particular evenings. It was not unhappiness. He was not an unhappy man. It was something more like the feeling a seed might have in good soil, pressing quietly outward in all directions in the dark, not yet knowing what shape it is pressing toward. He watched a star that stood alone at the rim of the sky, lower and steadier than the others, burning without blinking. He watched it for a long time. The lamp on the parapet burned down a little, and the wick moved in the breeze, and the small flame bent sideways, and then stood upright again. Down in the courtyard, Sarai had finished the evening's work, the bread wrapped and set aside, the clay jars sealed, the fire banked low for the morning. She moved quietly, as she always did, with that economy of motion that belongs to people who have thought carefully about where things ought to go and put them there. She poured water from a tall jar into a smaller one and carried the smaller one up the outside stair to the roof, where she set it beside her husband without a word and sat down beside him and also looked at the stars. Some silences between two people are a kind of fullness. This was one of those. The fig tree in the courtyard below moved in the night wind, its broad leaves rustling like distant rain. Somewhere along the river, one of the reed boats knocked softly against its mooring. In the lane outside the courtyard gate, a night watchman made his slow circuit with a lamp on a pole, the lamp swinging as he walked, throwing long shadows that swept the alley walls and then withdrew. His footsteps faded. The city breathed. The river moved. The stars held their slow courses in the enormous dark, and neither Abram nor Sarai felt any need to speak. There on the rooftop at the edge of the night, in the house that had always been their home. Old Terah had lived long enough to know that some of his sons were rooted and some were not, and he had made his peace with the difference long ago. Nahor was rooted, a man of the city, happiest among its lanes and markets and the steady work of settled life. But Abram had always been different, and Terah knew it, and the knowing sat in him quietly the way old knowledge tends to sit in old men, without urgency, without fear, held simply as a truth among truths. He had heard, in those later years of his life, a faint word of leaving, of going north toward another country. And when the time came, he was the one who first rose and said, "We go." So it was that the household of Terah began one season to have the look of a household preparing for a long road. Ropes appeared in corners, tent poles were checked and relashed, the waterskins were brought out from storage and tested and mended, their leather oiled with fat until it was supple and dark. The flocks, sheep and goats in considerable number, were counted and divided, the stronger animals set apart for travel. The servants moved with the particular purposeful quiet of people who have been told something large is coming and are getting their hands ready for it. The fig tree in the courtyard stood where it always had, not going anywhere. On one of those last evenings in Abram went down alone to the river. He sat on the bank among the papyrus stems in the late light and watched the water go. The river carried everything with it: the silt from the high country far to the north, the pollen from the date palms, the occasional slow turning of a water bird floating on a log, and the ordinary reflections of clouds and sky. It carried all of this without effort, as rivers do, because moving is what rivers are. Abram put his hand flat on the river mud beside him, feeling its cool dampness, and he thought that he had loved this city, and that he did not quite know what was calling him away from it, but that something was. The night came down over with its usual patience, a slow darkening from east to west until the whole sky was given over to stars. The lamps were lit in the lanes and the courtyards. The last boats were tied. The bread of the evening was broken in 100 households, passed hand to hand in the lamplight, and the city folded itself into the long, warm dark as it had always done, believing, the way cities always believe, that it will all be here in the morning, unchanged, waiting. The moon climbed above the palms and laid a long road of light across the river, pointing north, though no one on the bank was reading it that way. Not yet. In the house of Terah, the household slept. The fire in the courtyard was a low red glow among its stones. The tent poles lay in their bound bundles against the wall. The waterskins hung from their pegs, full and dark and patient. The fig tree was still. On the parapet above the courtyard, the small clay lamp that Abram had brought up earlier burned on without him. He was inside now, lying beside Sarai in the dark, listening to the city's breathing and the river's distant passing. Tomorrow, perhaps, or the day after, but the road was there, waiting in the north, as roads do. There is a particular quality to the last night in a place that has been home all your life. A tenderness that belongs to that night alone, though you do not always know, while you are in it, that it is the last one. The sounds are the same sounds. The smell of the mud and the lampwick is the same smell. The stars are exactly where they always are. And yet something in the heart knows, the way the migratory bird knows in its bones, the day before it lifts, that the long familiar world of this place is quietly completing itself. the way a story does when it reaches its last ordinary page before the road begins. And so the old story lets the city of rest here, in its lamplight and its river smell and its enormous sky before the road begins. It was a real place, with real mud on its walls and real bread on its tables, and real families folded into its warm dark. Abram and Sarai were real in it. His restlessness, her steadiness, the quiet between them on the roof, the fig tree's leaf falling into the courtyard, all of it real and ordinary and full of the weight of ordinary life. The city did not know it was about to become a beginning. Cities never do. They only know they are themselves, exactly as they are, in this moment, under the stars. We follow the family now up the long river. Terah gathered his household in the season when the river ran low, and the reed bed stood pale and dry along the banks. Abram his son, and Sarai Abram's wife, and Lot the son of Harran, who had died young, and all the living things that moved with them, the donkeys with their rope halters, the sheep with their soft noise, the camels folded and then rising at the pull of the lead rope. They turned their faces north and west, away from and the city fell slowly behind them like a lamp carried into another room. The road north was long, and the land changed around them slowly, the way land does when you are too close to it to notice. The flat river plain giving way to rolling scrub, the scrub giving way to rougher country where the track climbed between outcrops of pale limestone. They camped where water could be found, beside pools that smelled of reeds and mud, or at wells where other travelers had worn the stone rims smooth with the pulling of ropes. The nights were cold now, colder than and the stars were more numerous and more near, as though the sky had been rinsed clean by the wind that came down off the mountains in the north. Harran lay in a broad plain where two roads crossed, a town that smelled of wool and wood smoke and the dung of 1,000 animals. Its market lanes were narrow and loud in the mornings, loud with the bargaining of men who had come from every direction, from the river country to the south, from the cedar forests to the west, from the high passes to the north. But in the evenings the lanes quieted, and the cooking fires came out onto the doorsteps, and the smell of flatbread on hot stones drifted through the cooling air, and it was possible to forget that you had ever intended to go anywhere further. So they settled in Harran. The tents went up on the outskirts of the town, black goat hair tents pegged firm against the wind that came in off the plain, and around them the flocks spread out to graze on the scrub grass between the fields. Seasons turned. The lambing season came and went, and the shearing season, and the long dry season when the wells ran low and the sky over the plain was the color of old bone. Abram learned the wells of Harran and the roads between them. Sarai learned the women who drew water at those wells, their names and their children's names. The place became known to them in the way places become known, slowly, through use. Terah grew old in Harran. He had set out from with the intention of Canaan always in his mind, or so the old story tells it, and Canaan was still there, still south and west, still waiting beyond the hills that could be seen from the high ground above the town on a clear morning. But the road is a young person's idea, and Terah's years had grown heavy on him, and Harran was warm enough and known enough, and there is no shame in setting down what has become too heavy to carry. His years were full, and he was gathered to rest, and then the tents were quieter, and the question of the road was Abram's to carry now. It was in the quiet after that the word came. Not in any thunder, not in any fire. It came the way a thought comes that is deeper than your own thinking, the way a conviction arrives that has been growing in the dark long before you name it. The old story says a voice came to Abram in Harran, and the voice was clear and kind, and it asked of him the thing that is hardest and also the most natural, to go, to leave the country he had settled in, and his father's house, and the wells he knew by name, and to walk toward a land that would be shown to him on the way. The voice said, "Go from your country and your father's house to a land I will show you, and I will bless you, and your name will be a blessing." That was the shape of it, not a threat, not a demand framed in thunder, but something gentler, a door held open, a road indicated, and a promise laid alongside the asking, like a hand set lightly on the shoulder of a friend who is uncertain whether to rise. The land would be shown on the way. That was the particular tenderness of it. Not a destination handed in advance, but a showing step by step as the feet moved. Trust the road would reveal itself. Abram was 75 years old. That is worth sitting with for a moment. Not young, not a young man's impulsive departure, but a whole long life already lived and settled and rooted, and then the willingness to pull up the roots and go. There is something in that unhurried courage that the old story seems to love. A man of years, whose body knew what it meant to travel, whose hands had learned the particular ache of striking and repitching a camp in wind and cold. That man heard the word and said in his own quiet way, "Yes." The old story says nothing more of his deliberation. It simply says he went as the word had told him. And so, quietly, and in the way of people who have moved before and know the particular grammar of departure, the camp began to stir before dawn. The lamps inside the tents were doused one by one. The tent pegs were pulled from the earth, with the familiar pop and yield of soil, releasing what it had held. The goat hair panels were folded and rolled, and loaded onto the broad backs of the camels, who bore it all with their characteristic patience, blinking their long lashes against the dust. The sheep were collected from the edge of the camp where they had drifted in the night, and the donkeys were laden with the folded household, the pots, the grinding stones, the oil, the cloaks folded against the cold. Sarai was there at the center of it, as she always was, not standing apart and watching, but moving through the work with the particular authority of someone who has made and unmade a home enough times to know exactly where everything must go and in what order. She had not been asked. The old story does not say she was asked, and yet she was going, which tells you something about the quality of the life between them and the quality of her own courage, quiet as it was and largely unspoken. She rolled her own sleeping mat and tied it herself and handed it up to the camel loader without ceremony, and the morning received her as it receives everyone, without comment, impartially, in its early gray. Lot came too, Lot his brother's son, who had grown up in Abram's household after Harran died young and left the boy without a father. Lot was younger, and the road was still a young man's thing to him. It still held that shine it loses later, when you have slept enough nights on hard ground. He came with his own small flocks and his own tent and his own energy, and the morning was glad of his quicker pace. All the living things that Abram had acquired in Harran came with them too. Every animal, every servant of the household, every woven basket and clay jar and worn leather water skin. Whatever Harran had given them, they were taking south. The wells of Harran were behind them by the time the sun had fully risen. Abram turned south toward the land the voice had indicated, the land that would be shown. The road was known to traders. It ran south and west through country that gradually dried and lightened, the soil going from the dark loam of the river plain to a pale sandy earth that held the heat of the afternoon in its skin long after the sun had moved on. They were not the first people to walk that road, and they would not be the last. The road received them as it receives everyone, without preference, with only its own direction, south and then south again, and then the long climb into the highlands of Canaan. And the one who had called him out under those enormous stars was with him as he walked, not as a voice that continued to speak, not as anything that could be named or pointed to, but as a presence, the way the road itself is a presence, as the way the reliable returning of morning is a presence, steady and unhurried, and not requiring thanks to be real. Abram walked south. The flocks moved around him in their usual slow constellation. Sarai walked or rode as the day required. The road was long, and the land ahead was strange, and the promise was everything he had to walk toward. The highlands of Canaan rose around them as the weeks passed, limestone terraces and olive-gray scrub, the sharp scent of wild thyme underfoot, and between the hills a glimpse now and then of the blue distance to the west, where the sea lay hidden behind the farthest ridge. They came to a place called Shechem, in the shade of a broad old tree, a terebinth, kin to the oak, its canopy wide enough to shelter a small camp in the heat of the afternoon. The tree had stood there long enough that the ground beneath it was worn smooth by generations of travelers who had stopped for the same reason, because the shade was there and they were tired and the afternoon was hot. Here, the old story says, the word came again, quietly, briefly, in the way of a confirmation rather than a new instruction. This is the land, not yet his, not yet empty of its peoples, but named for him, promised to those who would come after him. Abram built an altar there, as he would build altars at other places along the long road. Simple things, unworked stones gathered from the hillside and set in order, no mortar, no chisel marks, just the stones as they were found, and the small fire of a thanksgiving offered in the open air. The smoke went up thin into the blue afternoon, and the terebinth held still above it, and the land lay around them in its ordinary majesty, quite indifferent to what had just been promised. They moved on, as they would always move on. The nomad's answer to every question is eventually the same. The flocks need new pasture, the water is running low, the next place is calling from beyond the hill. South of Shechem they camped between two hills, and Abram built another altar there, and the name of that altar and that place lived in the telling for a long time after. Then they moved on south again, into the Negev, that dry south country where the land goes thin and bare, and the sky becomes enormous overhead, and the night air is cool enough to make you pull the cloak tight long before the stars are fully out. The Negev taught them something the river country and even Harran had not: the particular discipline of the dry place, where every decision funnels toward the question of water. Where is the well? How far to the next wadi? How many days can the animals go without drawing? The caravan learned to move in the cooler hours and to rest when the sun was highest, and Abram learned the dry south country the way he had learned the wells of Harran, slowly, through the body, through trial, and through the reliable mercy of water found when it was needed. The Negev does not explain itself. It only offers what it offers, and you learn to be grateful for it. And then there was a season of famine. The rains had failed, and the pasture had gone gray, and the wells were low throughout the country, and the whole household turned toward Egypt, toward the Nile Valley, where the river was its own rain and the green never fully left the land. They went down into Egypt as people have always gone down into Egypt in the dry years, not in defeat, but in the practical wisdom of people who know that the living must be kept alive, and that the pride of staying in a dying field is a luxury that flocks and children cannot afford. The road to Egypt was long, and at the end of it, the green of the valley opened before them like a cool hand on the brow. They stayed a season in the green river valley, long enough for the flocks to recover their weight, long enough for the animals to drink deeply and the people to rest from the dry country. The Nile was wide and slow and brown, and along its banks the papyrus grew thick, and the ibis stood in the shallows in that particular stillness that wading birds practice, as though they have learned that patience is the most efficient thing. The household of Abram made its camp on the edge of the valley, neither fully of Egypt nor fully apart from it, and the season passed quietly, which is the best that can be said of any difficult season. It passed, and they were whole at the end of it. When the famine had eased in the hill country to the north, they turned back, the flocks grown fuller now, the water skins full, the caravan heavier than it had been on the way down. The road north out of Egypt climbs slowly, the green of the valley thinning behind you as you rise, the desert coming back around the edges of your vision like a tide returning, until the green is only a memory of green, and the pale limestone hills of the Negev are ahead again. Familiar and dry and home in the way that only difficult country can become home. Abram came back to the Negev and then north, moving by stages back toward the altar he had built between the hills. They came back to the altar between the hills, to the unworked stones set there on the way south, and Abram stood before it again in the thin morning air, and the old story says he called upon the name of the one who had brought him this far. Not with ceremony, no incense, no procession, just a man standing before his own small pile of stones in the early light, saying in whatever words came, "Thank you for the road so far and for the road still ahead." The stones were exactly as he had left them. The land was exactly as it had been, and he was back in it, changed in the way that any long journey changes a person, without being able to say precisely how. The tents came down in the dark before first light. A practiced quiet, ropes coiled, poles stacked, woven rugs rolled into their bundles. The women moved by memory, and the men by the sound of each other, and the flocks stirred and shifted at the edge of the camp, as if they too felt the loosening, the readiness, that slight lean of every creature toward the open road. When the eastern rim of sky went from black to the color of charcoal, everything was ready. The fire was put out with a handful of earth, and the ash cooled into the ground, and the ground kept it, and they moved on south. The caravan moved at the pace of the slowest lamb, which is to say it moved with great patience and without hurry, and there was a kind of grace in that. Donkeys swayed under their loads of folded tent cloth and clay jars. Camels rolled their great necks and set their feet down with the deliberate softness of creatures who understand the value of unhurried travel. Somewhere in the middle of the procession, a bell rang with each step. A low clay bell tied to the neck of the lead animal, and its rhythm became, after a time, the rhythm of the whole moving world. The flocks spread wide on either flank of the road, finding the dry grass between the stones, grazing as they walked. From a distance, from the ridge above, say, where a shepherd boy might stand to look back, they would have looked like slow cloud shadows moving across the land, shapeless and drifting and somehow purposeful at once. The dust they raised was fine and golden in the early light, and it hung behind them like a soft curtain slowly settling, marking where they had been, erasing it gently as it fell. Canaan received them the way old land receives travelers, without ceremony, without particular welcome, simply by being there, enormous and patient, its limestone ridges folding one into the next, its terraces of pale stone dropping down from the heights in long, careful steps that someone's hands had shaped long ago before memory. Olive trees grew along those terraces, their trunks twisted into shapes that suggested great age and great stillness, their leaves turning silver in the light when the breeze came across from the west. The scent of the sea carried faintly on it, like a rumor. There was broom in the valleys, its yellow flowers fierce and small against the dust, and thorn scrub that caught at the edges of robes as the path narrowed between the rocks. Lizards paused on the warm stones and then were gone. A hawk turned in a long, slow circle overhead, tilting its wings without effort, riding what it could not see. The road itself was less a road than a memory of many feet. The pressed earth, the worn stones, the slight hollow in the hillside. And it wound down and down again as the highlands breathed. In the middle of the day, when when the sun stood highest and the shadows huddled under their own objects, Abram called the halt, not by any signal anyone could describe afterward, simply by slowing and then stopping, and the whole caravan slowing and stopping around him, the animals glad for it. The donkeys lowered their heads. The camels folded themselves to the ground in their unhurried way, tucking their forelegs first, then the back, a slow, controlled collapse that always seemed about to become a disaster and never did. And for a time, in the shade of whatever shadow the land provided, everyone rested. Water was the great discipline of the road. They found wells where they had been told to look, at the base of a hill, where the path turned, at the edge of a dry stream bed that would run in the winter rains and lay quiet now, its white stones smooth and chalky. The wells were ringed with stone, the rims worn smooth by the ropes of many years. A bucket dropped into the cool dark below and came back up heavy and cold, and the sound of water poured into the troughs was, in that landscape, among the finest sounds the world contained. Sometimes other travelers came to the wells, a family with a smaller flock, a lone man with 2 donkeys, a woman with clay jars balanced on a wooden yoke. There were courtesies observed at wells, as there are courtesies observed wherever scarce and necessary things are shared. Room was made. The first to arrive drew for the others if the others were slow. The water was not owned by the one who found it. The old story makes note of this without making much of it. Simply that Abram moved through this land as a guest, careful with what was not his, generous with what was. We come now with them into the quieter north of the land, where the hills ease toward the valley of Shechem, and the air holds a little more moisture, and the vegetation thickens imperceptibly, broom giving way to sage and sage to the lower branches of something wider, something older. The path dipped into a shallow bowl of good earth, and there on its rim, in the fullness of its years, stood the great tree, a broad shade oak, the kind called a terebinth in the old tongue, kin to the oak in its shape and its patience, its canopy spread wide as a welcome. They pitched the tents in the tree's long shadow, and for the first time in many days the air was cool in the afternoon, and the animals settled without the usual restlessness that heat brings. Children who had walked all day lay down in the shade and were asleep before their mothers could spread anything for them to lie on. The old tree stood over all of it, the sleeping children, the folded tents not yet fully raised, the animals grazing the edge of the good grass, with the complete indifference and complete shelter that only old trees possess. It was here, at the great oak of Moreh near Shechem, that a quiet word came to Abram. Not in fire, not in storm, but in the way that a certainty arrives sometimes in a still place, simply present where it had not been before. The old story says only that the word was spoken, and that what it said was this: "To your descendants I will give this land." The words are few. They are not a riddle. They are a promise set down in the language of the long view. The view from high enough that a single man's single life is not the whole of the story, but a beginning. Abram stood in the shade of that old tree for a long time. The valley spread below him in the last of the afternoon light, its colors deepening from gold to amber to the first pale gray of evening. He could see the land a long way, the hills folding south, the limestone catching and releasing the light, the dark smudge of distant trees along a dry stream bed. And what he felt, the old story does not precisely say, only that he built an altar there. That seems to be the answer. When words are not enough, a man picks up stones. The stones were whatever the ground gave. Limestone pieces, rough-edged, some the size of a man's 2 cupped hands together. He did not dress them or fit them. The old custom required that the altar be as the earth had made its parts, unworked, uncorrected. He arranged them without mortar, each one set with care, the whole structure low and open to the sky. A small fire was laid on it. Dry scrub, a handful of brush, the smoke thin and pale as it rose and bent sideways in the evening breeze, and then dissolved into the enormous air above the valley. There is something to rest in that image. A man with his hands still dusty from the road, setting stones in a field he did not own, under a tree older than anyone could say, at the edge of a land he had been told was somehow his people's future. Not his own present, simply the future, and making from the available materials the quietest possible act of acknowledgement. No temple, no priest, no ceremony anyone passing would have recognized as significant. Just the stones, and the smoke, and the enormous sky receiving it. The next morning the tents came down again in that same pre-dawn quiet, and the caravan moved on south and east, following the ridge line into the higher country between Bethel and Ai, two villages on their separate hills, the land between them open and dry and full of light. The limestone here was paler, almost white in the midday glare, and the path was harder underfoot, the scrub lower. But there was a wide view from those heights, east and west and south, that made the effort of the climb worth the bearing, and Abram chose that open high ground for the next encampment. He pitched his tent there on the heights with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east, the two villages like quiet punctuation marks on either side of the open chapter of land. And he built another altar there, the second in this new country, again with the field stones the ground provided, again without mortar or shaping, the fire small and the smoke going straight up this time because the wind had dropped. He seemed to understand already that moving lightly through a land means marking it lightly, not with ownership, but with attention. The evenings on those heights were long and cool. The fire at the camp's center burned lower than it had in the valley. There was less need for its warmth at midday and more need for its company in the dark. And around it the household sat in the easy silence of people who have spent the day in motion and need now only to be still. Bread had been baked on flat stones at the fire's edge. Olives had been brought out in a clay bowl. Someone poured water. The smell of warm bread and cold night air and smoke is a particular combination that belongs entirely to open country living. Above them the stars came on one by one, and then all at once, the way they do in high, dry country, where there is nothing between the eye and the sky. The Milky Way was a river of light crossing the dark from edge to edge of everything, and Abram lay on his back in the cooling dust of the highland and looked up at it, the way a man does when he is not trying to understand something, but is simply allowing himself to be inside it. The land was quiet. The flocks were quiet. The fire had dropped to a soft orange pulse. Day followed day in the good rhythm of the road. Tents struck, the bell of the lead camel resuming, the dust rising, the watering at the day's midpoint, the watering at the evening halt, the fire, the bread, the stars. A person could lose track of the days in that rhythm, and perhaps that was not losing, but a different kind of finding. The self-measured, not in days counted, but in miles walked, in hills climbed, in the particular quality of light at the edge of each new valley. The land kept offering itself turn after turn, and he kept walking into it. There were evenings when the wind came in from the western sea, carrying the smell of something green and distant, and the tents pressed inward on one side and bellied out on the other, and the lamp at the tent door guttered and steadied and guttered again. Abram learned to read the land's weathers, the high cirrus that meant a change coming in 2 days, the particular stillness before a dawn that would be hot, the low clouds that gathered over the eastern hills and delivered nothing but their shadow. He was learning the land the only way a land can be learned, which is slowly from inside it. And so they moved through the land he had been shown, neither quickly nor slowly, the way water moves through dry country, finding the way that is open, pausing where there is shade and water, and moving on when the time comes to move on. Behind him, in the high country between Bethel and Ai, the field stones of the second altar stood in the morning light as he left them, unowned, unguarded, belonging to no one, and somehow on that account belonging to the land itself, which is perhaps what an altar is in the oldest understanding, not a thing built for God, but a thing given back to the ground. We go down with them now for a season. The land had grown thin in the way that old lands do, not all at once, but quietly, the way color leaves a cloth left too long in the sun. The wells dropped low. The pastures between Bethel and the dry south country turned pale and brittle underfoot, and the flocks moved restlessly from patch to patch of what little green remained, finding less each morning than the morning before. Abram watched the sky and watched the grass and knew, as every herdsman knows, that the time had come to follow the water. There was a road south that herdsmen had walked since long before any of them could remember, a road that wound down through the dry country, through the pale limestone hills and the scrub valleys, through the wide desert margins, where the wind moved the dust in long, slow curtains. Abram and Sarai and Lot and all their household gathered themselves. The goat hair tents rolled and bound, the tent pegs pulled from the red earth, the water skins filled at the last good well, the flocks and the asses and the few lean camels loaded and turned toward the south and the west, toward the great river country where the water never fails. The road south was long and the sun was strong, but there is a particular peace in a caravan that knows where it is going, a rhythm in the soft fall of hooves on dust, in the creak of loaded panniers, in the low murmur of the household moving together like a river finding its way downhill. Days passed under a white sky. The scrub grew sparser. The stone underfoot changed color, from the pale cream of the highlands to the redder, sandier earth of the deeper desert, and the air at midday was very still and held the heat like a lamp holds oil. And then, as the road descended and the land began slowly to open and soften, something changed in the air. It was the smell of it first, a green, living smell, faint as a rumor, carried on a morning breeze from somewhere ahead and below. Then the light changed, the hard-edged brightness of the dry country giving way to something gentler, more diffuse, as though the sky itself had taken a breath. The ground on either side of the road began to show small tufts of grass, then sedge, then reeds at the edge of a low place where water had pooled, dark and still and full of reflected cloud. The great river appeared to them slowly, the way a good thing tends to appear, not all at once, but in glimpses, in glints through palm fronds, in the broadening of the green margin on either side of the road, in the sound of water birds calling across open water. Then they came to the top of a low rise, and there it was, wide and brown and unhurried, moving as it had always moved, steady and enormous, carrying the dark water of distant mountains through this flat and ancient land, feeding everything it touched. The flocks smelled it and raised their heads and moved faster, and even the old camels seemed to quicken. They came down into the river country, and the green abundance of it was like stepping into shade after a long walk in the sun. Reed banks lined the water's edge, tall and feathery, rustling with the passage of herons and ibis that picked their careful way among the stems. Mud-brick villages sat on low rises above the floodplain, shaded by palm and sycamore, their lanes quiet in the heat of the day. The river smell was everywhere, rich and dark and faintly sweet, the smell of old silt and growing things, the smell of water that has come a very long way and arrived without hurry. Abram's household found a place in the green margin of the river country, as herdsmen do, not in the towns, but at the edge of them, where the pasture was good and the water near. The tents went up again, the black goat hair panels pulled out and stretched across their poles, the ropes staked into the softer earth, the lamps lit at evening where the fireflies moved among the reeds. It was a different kind of life from the highland country, lusher, warmer, slower. And for a season they rested in it, the thin months of the dry land already fading like a half-remembered dream. The river was generous as it had always been generous. The broad fields along its banks were dark with the old silt the flood left behind each year, and out of that darkness came barley and emmer wheat, flax and lentils, gardens of onion and leek, stands of fig and pomegranate. The household ate well in the river country. The flocks grew fat on the thick grass of the margins, and the animals that had been ribbed and slow at the end of the dry season filled out and grew glossy in the mild Egyptian sun. A season in the Green Valley was doing what a season in the Green Valley has always done. The river had its own light, not the hard white light of the limestone hills, but something softer and more golden, filtered through haze and humidity and the constant shimmer of the water's surface. At dawn, the river ran pink and copper, wide as a world, and the water birds lifted from the reeds in long, loose skeins against the brightening sky, pelican and ibis, egret and lapwing, calling to one another across the water in the ancient and different language of birds, who have been doing this since long before any city was built on any bank. Abram stood sometimes at the water's edge in the early morning and listened, and the sound was very old and very quiet. Along the river road, laden donkeys passed in both directions from morning to evening, traders carrying linen and grain, fishermen with baskets of dried fish, potters with their wares wrapped in straw. The mud-brick towns had their own quiet hum, the sound of grinding stones in the early hours, the smell of bread baking on hot flat stones, children's voices in the lanes, a dog barking somewhere in the palm shade. Abram's people moved among them easily, as nomads have always moved through settled places, respectfully, lightly, belonging a little everywhere and nowhere, which is its own kind of belonging. The seasons turned at the river's own pace, marked not by rain, but by the river itself, its swelling and its settling, its darkening and its clearing. They watched the flood come in and then withdraw, leaving its black gift on the fields. They watched the wheat come up out of that darkness, green and fine, and they watched it ripen to gold, and they were there when it was cut and the air smelled of chaff and dry stalks in the evening heat. A full season, and then another, and all the while the road home waited in the north, patient as a road always is, holding its direction without complaint. When the famine in the north had spent itself, as famines do in their own slow time, and word came back along the trader roads that the highland pastures had greened again, that the springs were running and the wells were full, Abram began to think of the road. He was that kind of man, a man who could rest, and rest gratefully, but who always knew when resting was done. The tents were struck again in the first coolness of the season, the flocks counted and the packs loaded, the water skins filled at the river that had sheltered them, and the household turned its face north and east, back toward the hills. The road home is always different from the road out, even when it follows the same ground. The going out carries the weight of the unknown. The coming back carries a different weight, the weight of what has been learned, what has been carried, what has grown. The flocks were greater now, the household fuller, the camels and asses more laden than when they had come down. The green margin of the river thinned behind them as they climbed north, the air drying slowly, the vegetation drawing back to scrub, the pale limestone reappearing underfoot, and the smell of the land shifting from the dark richness of the river to the clean, dry scent of the hill country. The Negev, that wide, pale, dry south country, received them again without ceremony, as the dry country always does, impassive, unhurried, asking nothing and offering its spare beauty freely. The thorny scrub and the limestone outcrops, the wide sky and the wind-scored wadis, the goats picking their way along the edges of things, it was all as they had left it, unchanged and unchangeable, the land that does not need its people in order to be itself. They moved through it as they had moved through it before, slowly and with attention. Each campsite a world for a night, each morning a new beginning in the same old country. And so in their own time they came up again into the central highlands, into the country between Bethel and Ai, where the limestone terraces step down from the ridge in long pale shelves, and the old terebinth trees, those broad dark-leafed shade trees, kin to the oak, stand scattered across the hillsides like patient sentinels. The air up here was cooler than the valley, thinner, cleaner, scented with wild thyme and the faint mineral smell of the rock. After the green abundance of the river country, there was a particular pleasure in this austerity, the pleasure of coming home to a place that expects nothing of you but your presence. And there it was, the altar. The old piled stones stood where they had been left, undisturbed. The fieldstones settled a little deeper into the ground perhaps, a growth of lichen beginning at one edge, but otherwise unchanged. No one had moved them. The land had simply held them in its keeping while he was away, the way land holds whatever is left to it without preference or complaint. Abram went to the altar and stood before it in the cool air of the highland morning, and he called on the name he carried within him, that quiet, unhurried name, and the calling was its own kind of coming home. The flocks spread out across the terraced hillsides, and the household settled back into the familiar rhythms of the highland life. The early rise before the heat, the slow movement of the animals from pasture to water and back, the evening fire and the smell of bread, the deep, untroubled sleep of people who have walked far and arrived where they were going. The tents stood in the old way, the ropes pegged into the limestone soil, the lamps lit at dusk, the goat hair panels breathing in the night breeze. The lean months in the dry land were fully past now, and the road that had taken them down and brought them back had done what roads do, faithfully and without fuss. The flocks had grown in the way that flocks do when the land is good and the seasons turn gently, quietly, one season to the next, until one morning Abram looked out from his tent door and saw the hillsides covered in a pale, moving wool, and knew that what had once been a modest company had become something very large indeed. Lot's herds had grown in the same way, spreading across the terraced limestone slopes like a second river, unhurried but unstoppable. And the two households together had become more than the highland country between them could comfortably hold. It was the wells that showed it first. The stone-rimmed wells in the dry south country were generous but not endless, and the herdsmen of both households were good men who wanted what was right for their animals, which meant, on a hot afternoon, they each wanted the same trough at the same hour. There was no quarrel of the deep kind, only the gentle friction of too many animals in too narrow a place, the way a river grows uneasy when too much water comes at once. The land was full of kindness, but it was also simply full. So Abram went to Lot, and the old story says he spoke the matter plainly and without any bitterness, the way a man speaks when he has already settled something in his own heart and is only asking the other to do the same. They went together to a high place in the highlands, where the land opened wide on every side, and the wind moved through the dry grasses with a sound like a long, slow breath, and you could see the country spread out below them like a cloth laid flat. Green in some parts, pale in others, the Jordan plain a bright thread in the south. Abram said very simply, "There is room for both of us if we part kindly, and we are kin, and there is no need for strife between us." And then he gave Lot the choice, all of it, freely, the elder making the gift to the younger without holding anything back, the way a generous man gives, which is the only way a thing given is truly a gift. If you go to the left, I will go to the right. If you choose the right hand, I will take the left. The wind moved across the hilltop. The flocks below them waited in their slow animal patience. Lot lifted his eyes, and what he saw in the Jordan plain was very beautiful. The old story tells it plainly. The plain was well watered, every part of it, like a garden, like the green country along a great river, and it shone in the morning like something poured out. And so Lot chose it, as a young man will choose the bright and visible thing. And he gathered his household and his flocks and went down toward the plain, and the two of them embraced and parted. And the road took Lot east and down toward the green and the water and the cities of the plain. And Abram stood on the hilltop a while longer, alone now, the wind still moving in the grasses, the sound of Lot's flocks fading as they went down the long slope. He did not mourn the choice. There was something in his bearing, the old story suggests, of a man who had already given something away and found himself lighter for it. He turned and looked west and north and south, the highland country, the pale scrubland, the limestone ridges running away into the haze. And all of it was his to walk through and to tend, which was all he had ever asked. Then the voice came again, as it had come before. Not loud, not sudden, but present in the way the wind is present, in the way the light on the stone is present. And it asked Abram to lift his eyes and look in every direction, north and south and east and west, because all the land he could see was to be part of what was promised. And so were his descendants, who would be as many as the grains of dust that a man cannot count however long he tries. These were ancient words, quietly given, and Abram received them the way he had learned to receive such things, with stillness, with a long breath, with trust. He moved his tents after that. Down from the high place and westward, through the pale limestone country, with the flocks picking their way along the familiar paths, the donkeys patient under their loads, the household following in the unhurried rhythm of people who have moved before and know how to do it, folding the goat hair panels, unstaking the ropes, loading the wooden tent poles across the broad backs of the animals, and then walking through the morning light until the land told them where to stop. The land told them to stop at Mamre, near Hebron, under the oaks. They were great, broad trees, older than anyone could say, the kind of tree that seems to have been there since the land first learned how to grow a tree. And they cast a shade so wide and so cool that the air beneath them was a different country from the blazing noon outside. The ground under the oaks was soft with old leaf litter, and the light came through the canopy in shifting pieces. And the smell was of bark and dried herbs and the particular dusty sweetness of old shade. And here, under the oaks of Mamre, Abram made his home. He built an altar of unworked stones, as he had built altars before, at Shechem and near Bethel and in the south, and the thin curl of smoke from it rose straight up in the still afternoon air beneath the great trees. The flocks were settled in the pastures around Hebron, and the tents were pegged in the old way, and the lamps were lit at dusk as they always had been. And the evening came down slowly over the oaks with its usual patient magnificence. This was home now, or as close to home as a tent could be. The days at Mamre settled into their own quiet shape, the mornings cool under the oaks, the afternoons long and bright and still, the evenings full of the sound of the flocks coming in and the smell of bread baking on the hot stones and the lamps going one by one around the encampment. Abram had learned to live in the rhythm of the land, which is a slow rhythm, and does not hurry, and asks only that you pay attention. He was an old man in the reckoning of those days, though the old story says he was still strong and his eyes were still clear when he looked at the stars. Then one day, word came from the east, the kind of word that travels on the lips of merchants and herdsmen and arrives tired and dusty at the tent door. There had been trouble among the cities of the plain, the word said. Kings from the far countries had come against the kings of the Jordan Valley, And in the confusion and the aftermath, Lot, his nephew, his kinsman, the young man who had chosen the green plain, had been taken and carried off northward with his household and his goods. The word sat in the tent like a stone. Abram did not delay. He gathered the men of his household, those who had been with him since Harran, those who had walked with him down through Canaan and out of the famine country and back again, and they went out by night, quietly, without ceremony, the way a man goes when he knows what he must do, and words would only slow him. The dark country passed under their feet in the hours before dawn, and the stars were very bright and very many, and the road north was long, but they did not complain of it. And Lot was brought home. The old story does not linger on the doing of it. It is told the way a man tells the part of the story he would rather not make into a story, briefly, without flourish, because what matters is not the going out in the dark, but the coming back in the light. Lot was brought home, and his household with him, and his goods, and the people who had been taken alongside him from the plain. The road south from the north country was long, but they walked it, and the morning rose over the hills as they came back down toward Canaan. It was on the road home, in the valley near the old city of Salem, that the meeting happened, the one the old story lingers over, and rightly so, because it was a meeting of a particular quality, the kind that leaves something behind even after the people have gone their separate ways. Out of Salem came Melchizedek, the king of that city, who was also its priest, a very old man by the look of him, with the unhurried manner of someone who has stood in many doorways and blessed many travelers and will do so again tomorrow. He brought bread and he brought wine, plain things, good things, the things that a host brings when he wants simply to feed the weary, without any demand in them. They spread what they had on the flat stones by the road, and the torchlight moved in the warm air, and the old king of Salem looked at Abram with a kind of recognition, the way old people sometimes look at one another, as if they know something that does not need to be said. He raised his hands over Abram and spoke a blessing, quietly, as all real blessings are spoken, and the words settled over the returned company like cool air at the end of a long day. The old king of Salem called Abram blessed by the Most High, the maker of heaven and earth, and he said that the Most High had delivered his enemies into his hand. He said these things plainly, as an old priest says plain things, not as a sermon, but as a simple statement of what he had seen and what he believed, the way a farmer speaks about the weather or a shepherd about the shape of the land. And when the blessing was finished, the king of Salem went back to his city, and the torchlight went with him, and the valley was dark again and quiet under the stars. Abram gave a tenth of everything he had recovered to the old king of Salem, a gift freely made, the way the gift to the priest at the roadside has always been made, out of gratitude for the blessing and for the bread. And when the king of the cities of the plain came out and offered him the goods and the spoils, and told him to keep them for himself, Abram declined, gently, without pride in the declining, simply without want. He had not gone out for goods. He had gone for Lot, and Lot was home, and that was enough. The company turned south, and the road home was wide and still. They came back through the limestone country in the slow warmth of the day's end, the men quiet and easy beside one another, the donkeys patient, the scrubland on either side of the road growing familiar again, the low gray-green of the thorn bushes, the occasional flash of a bird through the brush, the smell of warm dust and dry stone. The miles passed, the way good miles pass, without hurry, and the oaks of Mamre appeared on the horizon like old friends who had waited without impatience. The tents were lit when they arrived, the lamps in the doorways throwing their warm circles on the ground, the smell of supper and wood smoke drifting out under the great oaks. Abram settled back into the life of the encampment the way water settles back into its level. Easily, without announcement, the animals watered and stabled. The men fed. The talk around the fire low and unhurried, the way talk is when the hardest part is past and everyone is simply glad to be where they are. Lot was safe. The oaks stood in their old patience. The stars came out one by one, very many. And so Abram rested under the oaks of Mamre, and the oaks held the darkness kindly around him, and the stars above the canopy were the same stars that had always been there, which is a thing that brings a particular comfort, to know that what is above you tonight was above you last night, and will be above you tomorrow, vast and patient and unconcerned with hurry. He had given freely, and come back with his hands no fuller than when he went, and the night did not seem to find anything wrong with that. The lamps burned low in the tent doorways, one by one, and the encampment was still. The night deepened after that, as nights in the hill country will, the air cooling sharply, the silence thickening until even the goats were still. Abram sat at the door of his tent, his cloak drawn close, watching the last lamplight in the camp gutter and dim. He was an old man by now in many of the ways that matter. His back knew the long road, his hands knew the weight of years. And yet sleep did not always come easily when the sky was this wide and this clear and this full of something he could not name. And into that stillness, not loudly, not with any thunder or brightness, simply as a word arrives when it is ready, a word came to him. The old story says it came as a voice, and the voice said, "Do not be afraid, Abram. Do not be afraid." 3 words only to begin. And something in the old man's chest, which had perhaps been braced for a long while without his quite knowing it, loosened a little, the way a rope loosens when the load it has been carrying is gently set down. Then the voice said, "Come out." And Abram came out from the tent into the open air, and the sky came down over him like a held breath, enormous, thick with stars, star upon star upon star, the great river of them overhead so dense it cast its own pale shadow on the ground. He had lived under open skies for years by then, had slept many a night with nothing but the dark above him. But the sky that night was different in the way that some nights are simply, quietly different. "Look up," the voice said. "Look up toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them." The old man tilted his head back. He could not count them. No one has ever counted them. They spread from the dark line of the hills on one side to the dark line of the hills on the other, and behind them there were more, and behind those more still, receding and receding in a cold, bright abundance that had nothing to do with human arithmetic. "So shall your descendants be," the voice said. "So shall they be." And Abram, this is the quiet heart of it, told plain and warm as the old story always tells it. Abram believed. Not because it was easy to believe. A man of his years, his wife no younger, and no child had come in all the long road from Ur to here. But he stood under the stars, and he believed what had been spoken. And the old story says it very simply. It was counted to him as trust, as faithfulness, as the right and settled thing. And in the cold night air, that trust was as real as the smell of the dry grass and the weight of the cloak on his shoulders. He stood there a long while. There was no hurry in the night. The stars did not move perceptibly, though if you watched long enough you could feel the whole great wheel of them turning, slow and patient and ancient beyond imagining. The scrub grass smelled dry and faintly sweet where the evening dew had found it. Somewhere down the slope a sheep shifted and settled with a small sound that was really just the sound of contentment, of warmth against warmth. And Abram stood and looked up and did not try to count what could not be counted. We follow him now into the days that came after, days of ordinary tent life and moving flocks, the slow rhythms of a pastoral household in the hill country. But the sky had changed for him, or he had changed under it. it is hard to say which. There is a word the old story uses for what passed between Abram and the voice that night, a word that means something like a covenant sealed between parties, a promise made with witnesses and with solemn care. And it was not yet finished, that sealing. It would need its own evening, its own old rite, to be made whole. When that evening came, Abram prepared it with care. He brought animals, a heifer, a she-goat, a ram, and 2 birds, and he laid them out along the ground as the old custom required, each in halves, a path made between them on the earth. It was an ancient way of sealing a thing, the old story says, a rite that both parties knew and understood. To walk between the pieces was to say, "May this be done to me if I do not keep what I have promised." Abram laid it all in order, quietly, in the long light of the declining sun. Birds came, as birds will when something is set out on the ground, dark shapes dropping from the pale sky, wings clattering. Abram shooed them away, again and again, patient and persistent, standing guard over what he had prepared in the way a man stands guard over something that matters. The sun moved lower. The sky went from blue to the pale color of old bone, and then to amber, and then to a deep, bruised rose along the western edge of the hills, and the air cooled, and the birds stopped coming, and the silence settled back down around the clearing like a cloak. As the sun went down, and the first stars pricked through the darkening blue, a deep sleep fell over Abram. Not the ordinary sleep of a tired man, but the heavy, weighted sleep of something significant passing near, the kind of sleep that leaves you knowing when you wake that something has shifted while you lay there. He lay on the cooling ground, and the stars came out fully above him, and the night pressed gently down, and there was a great stillness that was not empty but full, full the way a held breath is full. And then, in the thick dark, the dark that comes at the deepest part of the night, when even the stars seem to withdraw behind their own cold light, something moved in the clearing. The old story tells it simply, without elaboration, without explanation. A smoking firepot and a burning torch, passing gently between the pieces laid upon the ground. Flame and moving light. Smoke rising in a slow column into the dark air. Not a figure, not a form. Only light going where light goes, deliberate and warm between the 2 rows, from one end to the other and back. It passed between the pieces the way a promise passes between 2 people, quietly, without fanfare, and yet with the full weight of the thing behind it. And in the old story's telling, there were words that accompanied it, words about this land, about the children of children of children who would one day walk here, from the great river in the east to the sea in the west, all of it held in a night and a flame and a sleeping man on the cool ground. The smoke rose and was carried eastward on a small breath of wind, and the torch moved, and the firepot glowed, and the dark held still. Then the light passed and was gone, and only the embers remained, small orange points on the dark ground, breathing in and out very slowly, the way things breathe when they are winding down towards stillness. The smoke thinned to a thread and then to almost nothing. The clearing was quiet. The stars resumed their patient turning, and Abram lay there in the deep sleep, and the promise had been sealed in the old way, with fire and smoke and the willingness to be held to it, and the land and the night were witnesses to all of it. He woke. The old story does not say exactly when, only that he woke, into a world that looked as it had always looked. The same dry scrub, and the same limestone hills, and the same pale beginning of light at the eastern edge of the sky. But he lay still for a moment before he rose, the ground cold under him, the air carrying the last thin ghost of smoke, and something had settled in his chest that had not been there the night before. Not certainty exactly. Something quieter than certainty. The way the ground feels solid underfoot, even when you cannot see what is beneath it. He rose slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who has been on the ground all night. He gathered his cloak around him. The birds were beginning, one tentative call from somewhere in the scrub, then another, then a small quarrel of sparrows in a nearby thorn bush that settled as quickly as it began. The hills were coming back from the dark, ridge by ridge, each one a shade lighter than the one behind it, until the furthest visible hill was almost luminous against the deep blue sky. He turned his face toward the camp and walked. By the time he reached the tents, the sky had gone from gray-blue to the color of shallow water, and a stripe of gold was pressing up behind the eastern hills. The camp was beginning to stir, a woman with a clay jar moving toward the water, a child running between tent ropes with no particular purpose, as children do, a herd boy standing at the edge of the animals with his staff, counting under his breath. Ordinary morning. The smell of bread beginning on a hearthstone, flat and warm and good, the smell of every beginning. Abram went to his tent and sat in the opening, looking out. The gold stripe widened and became the sun, and the sun came over the hill, and the whole wide landscape answered it. The gray scrub going warm, the limestone outcroppings catching white, the dew on the goat hair of the tents glittering briefly before it was gone, burned off in the first dry warmth of the morning. He sat and watched all of it the way a man watches something that has newly become his own, or that he has newly understood to be his own, with a particular quiet attention, unhurried, content. The stars were gone. They are always gone by morning, which is one of the things that makes them worth watching when they are there. But he carried them now, in the way you carry something that has been given to you with great seriousness, not in your hands where you might set it down, but somewhere deeper, somewhere that does not forget. The promise was in the stars, and the stars would be back tonight and every night after, patient and innumerable, turning their slow wheel above the hill country, above the tents and the flocks and the dusty road, above the long waiting that was still ahead of him and that he was quietly prepared for. And so the morning came on, as mornings do, with no particular ceremony. The bread done on the stone, the animals moving to pasture, the ordinary business of a traveling household finding its rhythm for another day. The promise made under the stars went with him into that morning, not in fire now, not in the voice of the deep night, but in the plain texture of the day, in the solid ground and the good warmth and the work of the day ahead. And that, the old story suggests, is how most of the keeping of promises is done, not in fire and smoke, but in the quiet, ordinary days that come after. He ate and drank from the water jar, and the cold of the all-night ground slowly left his bones in the warmth of the morning sun. The tent ropes hummed very faintly in a small and passing wind. Somewhere behind the camp, a turtle dove was calling, that low, unhurried sound that belongs completely to the warm part of the morning, to the hour when the world has fully woken and is not yet troubled by the heat of the day. Abram set down the bowl and turned his face to the south, to where the road still led, and where there was still far to go, and was not afraid. The old story gives him that, not the end of the waiting, not the full shape of what was promised, but the morning after the fire and the dark. A man standing in the clear light of an ordinary day, the stars remembered behind the blue, the embers cold in the clearing up the hill, and the road still open before him, and the whole vast patient sky above. He would walk further yet. There were many seasons still to come, and many nights of stars, and the promise would keep arriving in its own unhurried time, the way all deep things arrive, slowly and more completely than you expected, and always in the morning. And so the seasons turned at Mamre, beneath the broad old shade trees whose roots went down past memory. Abram's tents were dark against the pale hills, their guy ropes singing in the night wind, and the flocks moved in slow arcs across the terraced slopes, their bells a soft and constant counting. The days came and went like the turning of a great wheel, dry season and the early rains, the hard ground softening under the first drops, the barley showing green along the wadis, and the wheel turned and turned, and the tents remained, and the promise remained with them, quiet as the stars overhead. There was a life of goodness in those hills, full and quiet and generous. The lambs born in the cold months were carried in the folds of cloaks until they steadied on their legs. The morning air smelled of dew on limestone and the green, resinous breath of the shade trees. The herdsmen knew one another's voices, and the wells were shared in the old, unhurried way. And bread was broken at the tent door in the long evenings, when the light went slowly and goldenly down behind the western hills, and the first stars appeared one by one above the ridge. But there was a quiet ache that lived alongside the goodness, soft and patient as a stone worn smooth by years of water. Sarai moved through the mornings with grace and steadiness, managing the tent, the stores of grain and dried fig, the woven mats, and the jars of oil. She was not a woman given to complaint. Only sometimes, in the late afternoon when the light lay long and warm across the hills and the children of the herdsmen ran shouting among the tents, she would be still a moment, watching, her hands quiet in her lap, her face open and unguarded, and then she would rise and tend the lamp. Abram too felt the passing of the years, though he carried it differently. In the long way he would stand at the edge of the camp after supper, when the fire had burned low and the smoke rose straight into the cold upper air, looking out at the enormous night. The stars were always there, exactly as they had been on the night the word came to him. Vast and uncountable and very near, and he would stand beneath them, an old man in a worn cloak, remembering the voice and the number and the night, and the remembering was both a comfort and a mystery, the way all old promises feel when the time between seems long. In those years, as was the custom of the ancient world, and the old story tells it plainly, without apology, Sarai came to Abram with a proposal born of her own patient sorrow. She had a serving woman, Hagar, a woman of Egypt, strong and capable, who had been part of their household since the days when they had passed through the Green River Valley to the south. Sarai brought her to Abram, gently but plainly. Perhaps through Hagar a child might come to the household, a child whom Sarai might call her own, as was the old way. And Abram listened and agreed, and the household was rearranged quietly around this new arrangement. Hagar was young, and she was perceptive, and when she found that she was carrying a child, something shifted in the air of the tents. The old story says it plainly. The two women looked at each other differently, and the weight between them was real. However quietly it was carried. No cruelty is named here, no hard words recounted, only that the tents felt smaller somehow, and that Sarai's grief and Hagar's new status and the long waiting years were all pressing at once against the walls of a home that had always been stretched tight between hope and patience. And one morning, Hagar was gone. She had taken the road south, the long, pale road that wound out of the highlands and into the open country, the dry brush country, the pale gravel flats, the places where the land opens wide and the sky comes down enormous on all sides and you feel very small and very alone. Hagar walked through the heat of the day, and the dust rose around her sandals, and the scrub cast no shade worth stopping for. She carried little. She was a woman with nowhere yet to arrive, and the road was long, and the country was vast, and the sky held no answer that she could hear. And then she found it, or it found her. A spring, rising clear and cold among pale stones at the edge of the road, in a place that had no name yet. Water, clean and cold, welling up from somewhere deep in the earth, pooling in a hollow of smooth rock, silver in the afternoon light. She sat beside it and rested, and the water moved gently at its rim, and the silence of the wilderness was a different silence now. Not the silence of being forgotten, but the silence before something is said. She cupped the water in her hands. She drank, and then she was not alone. A voice, the old story says only that. A voice, close and kind, as real as the water on her palms, and the voice called her by her name, Hagar. Not her station, not her role, her name, the name that had been given her long ago, back in the country she had come from, the name that in the busy life of the tents was rarely spoken. In all those years of service, it was possible she had not been called by her name as often as she deserved. And the voice called her Hagar and asked where she had come from and where she was going, and she answered, honestly, she was running away. The voice listened. The old story makes room for that, for the listening before the speaking. And then it spoke again, gentle and full. She was to return, and she would bear a son, and his name would be Ishmael, a name meaning, in the tongue of that country, God has heard, because what had been heard out here in the empty country where no one thought to look was her distress, her long days of walking and her cup of cold water and her honest answer about running away. She had been heard, and her son, the voice said, would be a man of the open country, strong and numerous and many, and his people would be great. And Hagar, and this is the tender heart of the whole account, the thing the old story could not help but preserve. Hagar gave a name to that place. She called it Beer Lahai Roy, which the old tongue means the well of the one who sees me. And she spoke it aloud into the empty air, as if testing whether it were true. Have I truly seen the one who sees me? Have I been looked at all the way out here in this place where there is nothing but stones and water and sky? And the spring answered nothing because it did not need to. The name was the answer. The name would stand in that place for a long time. She rose from the spring and turned back north, the way she had come. The road was the same road, the dust the same dust, but something in her had been rearranged. The way a room is rearranged when you open a window you had forgotten about, and the light comes in from a new direction, and all the old things look different. She walked back through the evening, and the stars came out one by one above the pale road, and she carried in her a new name for herself as well, though the old story does not record it, the name of a woman who had been seen when she did not expect it, in a place no one thought to look. And she returned to the tents. The old story says it simply, without drama. She returned, and in the fullness of time she bore a son, and Abram called his name Ishmael, as she had been told. There is something very quiet and very ordinary in the telling of it. A boy born, a name given, the sound of a newborn's cry among the ropes and pegs and woven rugs of the camp, a thing that had not been there before. Abram held the child, and the old story does not describe his face in that moment, but perhaps it does not need to. The holding is enough to know. A child had come to the household at last. Ishmael grew in the tents the way children grow in the open country, quickly and in all directions. He was among the flocks early, and he learned the names of the hills and the wells and the dry riverbeds that ran with water in the rain season and were silver pale and quiet in the dry months. His mother's people were desert people, and she taught him the desert's language, how to read the color of the sky before a sandstorm, how to find the damp ground where a well could be dug, how to move through the open country without frightening the game. He was glad in the open air, and Abram was glad watching him. And so there was a child's voice in the camp. There were small sandals at the tent door. There was a boy's particular kind of questioning, the rapid kind that does not wait for the full answer before the next question arrives. And there was laughter, the bright, sudden kind that children carry into old places and leave behind them like a gift. Hagar moved through the days with a steadiness that was new in her, the steadiness of a woman who has been seen and named and has built herself a life from that. And Abram grew older, and the years passed gently, and the promise moved in its own patient time, deep as the roots of the old shade trees at Mamre. The years turned slowly, as years do when a person has learned to stop counting them too closely. And then one day the promise returned, not as a rumor or a distant thing, but close and settled, like a hand placed quietly on a shoulder. The old story says that a word came to Abram in the warmth of a spring afternoon, when the oaks of Mamre were full and green, and the air smelled of dry grass and warm stone. And it said, "The name you have carried all your life will be carried no longer." Abram, which means something like exalted father, a name that had always sat a little ahead of him, a little larger than the life he had lived. Abram would now be called Abraham, which means father of many, or father of a multitude, a name vast enough to hold a whole future. The telling is plain and warm. The name was changed, and the man who carried it stood a little differently in the afternoon light, as though the new name had settled something in him that the old one had always been reaching toward. And Sarai, which is a name like a closed room, beautiful and private, Sarai would now be called Sarah, which opens like a door, a word that means princess or noblewoman, a name that carries its head high. The change was quiet, no ceremony, only the soft insistence of a word spoken in the afternoon, that from this day the woman who had walked every road beside him, who had folded and unfolded the great tent in 100 different places, who had carried the promise as long as he had, would be called Sarah. And a sign of the covenant was kept quietly by his household from that day. One soft line is all the telling asks of it, a mark carried in the body, private as breath, kept from that morning forward by the people of his tents. The old story does not linger here. It moves on into the bright particular afternoon, the oaks and the heat and the road that winds past the tent door at Mamre, because something is coming, and the afternoon is ready for it. It was the heat of the day, the kind of heat that flattens the world and makes everything hold very still. The flies slow, the goats in the shade of the acacia scrub, the birds gone silent in the branches. Abraham, the name is new, and this is the first afternoon it belongs to him. Abraham sat at the entrance of his tent under the broad oaks of Mamre, in the shade that the great canopy threw across the pale ground. He was an old man, his eyes were half closed. The heat pressed down like a warm hand. He looked up. The old story says only that he lifted his eyes, and there they were. 3 travelers standing quietly on the road, as though they had always been there, and he had only just noticed. 3 figures in plain robes, the dust of the road still on them, standing in the full white glare of the midday sun. Abraham did not sit and wonder. He rose from his place, quickly, the way a younger man rises, and went out to meet them on the road, bowing low in the old manner of welcome. "My lords," he said, the word in the old tongue that means simply sirs or friends, honored ones, the word a man uses when he wants to give everything he has to someone who has stopped at his door. "Do not pass by your servant." "Let a little water be brought," he said, "and wash your feet and rest under the tree." He said rest under the tree the way a man says it when he means rest here as long as you wish. Rest here as long as the oak stands. Rest here and let me feed you and let my tent be yours. The 3 travelers said, "Do as you have said." And something in the simplicity of it, the way they did not refuse, did not perform politeness, simply agreed, as though rest under his oak was exactly what had been intended, settled warmly in the air. They came into the shade. The great oak stood over them, holding the worst of the heat back. Abraham moved with a sudden lightness, hurrying to the tent, calling Sarah's name from the entrance, his voice carrying the particular urgency of a host who has decided that nothing but the very best will do. "Hurry," he said to Sarah. 3 measures of fine flour, the best flour, knead it and make bread cakes on the stones." His voice was pleased with itself, the way a host's voice gets when the occasion is larger than an ordinary afternoon. Sarah's hands were already moving. She knew the measure of hospitality her husband kept. She had kept it beside him for a lifetime. The tent filled with the sound of flour falling from the scoop and the dry dust smell of it, and then the deeper smell of water added and dough beginning. Abraham himself went out to the herd. The afternoon heat was still total, still white, and he moved through it quickly, choosing a calf, a tender one, a good one, and gave it to the young man of the household to dress and prepare. He brought curds and milk and set them in the shade. He brought the bread Sarah had baked, the bread still warm from the stones, smelling of the fire beneath them. He set everything before the three travelers and stood quietly near them, under the tree, as a good host stands, present but not hovering. The three travelers ate. There is something deeply good about that sentence. They ate in the shade of Abraham's oak, the bread Sarah made, the curds and the milk, in the full heat of the midday afternoon. And Abraham stood by them under the tree. The scene has a stillness to it that no amount of years has worn away. Three men eating, an old man standing in the shade nearby, watching with the quiet satisfaction of a host who has given his best and knows it. The oak overhead. The heat held back by the leaves. Then one of the travelers spoke. The voice came from the shade, unhurried, as calm as the afternoon itself. "Where is Sarah, your wife?" the voice said. And Abraham, who had not given the visitors his wife's new name, felt something catch quietly in the air. "She is in the tent," he answered, and the voice, still from the shade, still unhurried, said a thing that was either a very great promise or the most extraordinary sentence ever spoken in the heat of a spring afternoon in the shade of the oaks of Mamre. "This time next year," the voice said, "Sarah, your wife, will have a son." The words landed in the shade like something set down gently after being carried a very long way. This time next year. Not someday, not in the fullness of time, in the great patient future of the stars. Next year, at this season, when the oaks are full again and the heat is like this, Sarah will have a son. Abraham stood under the tree and heard it, and did not speak, and the afternoon continued around him, warm and still and ordinary. Now Sarah was listening behind the tent flap. The old story says so plainly, and there is nothing to be ashamed of in it. A woman hearing her own name spoken by strangers at her husband's table would listen too. She heard the words about the son. And Sarah laughed. It was a small laugh, an inward laugh, a laugh that comes from a very long way down in a person. The laugh of someone who has wanted something for so many years that the wanting has worn itself smooth and quiet, and to be told now is almost too much to hold. She laughed and thought, "I am too old. We are both too old. Abraham is an old man, and I have long since passed the years of such things, and here in the heat of the afternoon, strangers say next year." The laughter was not cruel, not unbelieving, not even really disbelieving. It was the laughter of someone who has learned that hope is a strange country and who is suddenly standing at its border again and does not quite know what to do with her own feet. It was a very human laugh. It is still recognizable, that laugh, across all the years between then and now. The voice from the shade said gently, "Why did Sarah laugh?" And Sarah, startled, said from behind the tent, "I did not laugh." And the voice said, with something in it that was neither scolding nor harsh, but simply steady and warm and a little amused, "You did laugh." And there was a question folded into the afternoon. Is anything too wonderful? And the question was not really a question. It was a kind of opened door, left standing open, asking nothing of her except that she walk through it. And the afternoon held still around all of them. The laughter was kept. The story keeps it, tenderly. The child to come would be named for it. In the language the old story was first told in, the word for laughter and the name Isaac sound the same, one folded inside the other like bread and cloth. So Sarah's laugh, that small, inward, too large to hold laugh behind the tent flap on a hot afternoon, would be woven into the name of the child, carried forward, turned from a moment of bewilderment into a name that children would call out across the years. Isaac. Laughter. The promise laughed into being. The meal was done. The oak shade had moved a little, the way it does in the afternoon when the sun has begun its long turn toward evening, and the light through the leaves was a deeper gold than it had been. The three travelers rose. They rose the way people rise who have somewhere to go, who have always had somewhere to go, quietly and without ceremony, and they looked toward the plain. Abraham walked with them a little way, as a good host does, onto the road that led toward the south, the road toward the Jordan Plain and the distant cities there. He stood on the road and watched them go, the way a person watches guests leave who have given him more than he gave them. The evening was beginning to breathe, the air a degree cooler, the oaks settling into their evening sounds, the light wind in the upper branches, a dove somewhere inside the grove. Behind him, the tent at Mamre was full of the smell of bread and the warm ash of the cooking fire, and Sarah was moving within it, quietly, the way she moved when she was thinking about something too large to speak aloud yet. The old man turned and walked back under the oaks, back to the tent door, back to the familiar circle of the encampment, the ropes and wooden pegs, the smell of the animals settled for the evening, the last light in the leaves above. And somewhere in him, quiet and sure as the roots of the oaks beneath the ground, something had shifted. The promise was no longer starlight and distance. It was bread and curds on a cloth in the shade, and a voice speaking a year, and a woman laughing behind a tent flap on a hot afternoon in the oaks of Mamre. We leave him there for now, in the last warmth of the afternoon among his oaks. The evening star had appeared above the tree line, faint and early, like the first word of a sentence the night was only beginning to say. And in the tent, Sarah's hands were still. She was not laughing now. She was holding the afternoon very quietly inside her, the way you hold something you are not sure of yet, something that might be true, something you might be willing, just barely, to begin to believe. The three travelers had gone, moving south along the high road, their robes pale against the darkening land, and Abraham now, as the story already knew him, walked a little way out from the oaks to watch them go. The plain spread wide below the ridge, and the first stars were pressing through the pale sky above the eastern hills, soft and early, the way they always came in the hour just after the light fails, and the world seems to hold its breath between one thing and the next. He stood on the high place above the plain of the Jordan, above all the cities of the valley laid out below like embers in a hearth, their small lights pricking the thickening dark. He thought of Lot, his brother's son, who had chosen that green country long ago and made his tent there, and who now lived within those walls. And something in him, the same something that had always made him stop at wells, at altars, at the edge of open country, grew very still and waited, and then began quietly to speak. The old story tells it gently. He stood before the presence of the one who had called him out of Ur, and he asked for mercy, not for himself, for strangers in a city not his own, for people whose faces he did not know, for Lot and for all who lived beside Lot in the valley. His voice was careful and quiet, the way a man speaks when he knows he is asking for something large, and yet cannot help asking. He spoke as a man speaks who loves what he does not wish to see broken. He said, "Suppose there are 50 who are good in the city. Would the one sweep them away with the rest?" And the answer came quiet as the turning of the night. For 50 the one would not. And Abraham stood there with the stars thickening overhead, and he counted again, slowly, the way you count something precious, something you do not want to lose. 45, he said. 40. The counting was its own kind of love, each number a small lowering of himself, a further opening of the hands. 30, he said. And the night held still, patient. 20. And still the answer, for 20's sake I will not. He paused then, the old man, feeling the weight of what he was about to ask, feeling perhaps how small the number had become, and he said one last time very quietly, "Let not the one be angry, and I will speak only once more. Suppose 10 are found there." And the answer came back through the wide, listening dark, "For the sake of 10 I will not." And that was all. He had asked what he could ask, had carried his love for Lot and for every stranger in that valley as far as the asking could go. The stars were fully out now, enormous above the ridge, and Abraham turned and walked slowly back through the oaks of Mamre toward his tent. The night air was cool and smelled of stone and of the dry grasses the day had warmed. A small lamp burned at his tent door. He went inside, and the dark closed gently behind him. The night passed the way nights do in that country, slowly and with a quality of weight, the stars moving their long arc westward, the plain below lying still. And in the gray hour before sunrise, when the darkness had thinned to the color of pewter, and the birds in the oaks had not yet begun, something was already happening in the valley. The two travelers who had sat under the oak tree the day before were moving in the city now, gently, purposefully, their feet quick on the stone-flagged lanes. The old story says they took Lot's family by the hand and led them out, gently, urgently, like people who know that the moment for lingering has passed. "Do not delay," they said. "Do not look back at the plain behind you. Go up to the high ground and do not stop." And so, in the gray gold light of the very early morning, a small family went out through the gate of the city and turned their faces toward the hills, the road rising before them, the plain spreading wide and silent at their backs. They went up the road with the first light gathering around them, the dew on the stones, the smell of dust and juniper, the path climbing through pale scrub. The morning was very quiet. The valley below them was still in shadow, and behind them, far away, not near, not loud, not something you could clearly name, there was a glow on the southern horizon, like a sunrise that had come to the wrong place, like a brightness low in the sky where brightness did not belong. The little family did not look back. They kept their eyes on the road ahead and went on. And the story does not follow them further. It leaves them there, safe on the morning road, going up toward the high country, the road solid beneath their feet, the sky lightening above. The old story is merciful in that way. It knows when to let people go quietly into their next life. And so we leave them too, climbing in the early gold, and we turn, the way the story turns, back to the ridge above the valley, back to the oaks, back to the tent, and the man who had spent the night asking. Abraham had risen before the sun and gone out to the place on the high road where he had stood the night before. He stood there again in the gray gold of early morning and looked out over the plain. Mist lay in the low places, soft and white, filling the wadis like poured wool. The valley was quiet in a way that the valley had not been quiet before, a settled quiet, a morning after something large and unreachable had passed through the night. He looked for a long time. Then he turned and went back to his tents. The oaks of Mamre were warm in the new light, the bark golden gray, the leaves turning their undersides to catch the early breeze. A goat had wandered to the edge of the shade and stood blinking in the sun. Somewhere behind the tents, a woman was already grinding grain, the soft, rhythmic sound of it carrying easily in the morning air. Abraham came through the trees and ducked under the tent flap and sat down, and the morning settled around him like water finding its level. The promise was still standing. Lot was safe. The day had begun. The months turned in their slow wheel. The barley harvest, the long rains, the dry season, and back again to barley. And then one morning, before the sun had cleared the limestone hills, there was a sound from inside the tent that no one who heard it ever forgot. A newborn's cry, thin and clear as a reed flute, cutting through the dawn quiet. Sarah held him first, his head no larger than a pomegranate, his fingers curled against her wrist. She was laughing and weeping at once, and the two things could not be told apart. Abraham came and knelt beside her, and the boy was placed against his old shoulder, and he stayed very still, the way a man stays still when he is holding something that has taken a lifetime to arrive. Outside, the encampment was already stirring, a herder's low call to the flock, the clank of a clay water jar being lifted, the first goats pressing toward the gap in the rope fence. But in the tent, it was quiet. The child breathed, rapid and small, and Abraham breathed with him, and neither of them moved. They named him Isaac, which means laughter, because that was the true name for it, for the laughter that had come first in disbelief and arrived now in joy, and found they were the same laughter after all, only finished. Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears will laugh with me." She said it quietly, like a fact, like the name of a well or a hill, and she was right. The women of the household smiled when they heard it, and the herdsmen smiled too, though they were far off and could not have said why. The tents at Mamre had always been a place where things happened slowly. Seasons arrived, flocks were counted, altars were built from whatever uncut stones lay nearest, but now the whole encampment moved around a new center of gravity. The boy slept in a basket of woven reeds close to where Sarah slept, and one of the household women sat near him through the night, keeping the moths away with a slow fan of palm frond. The lamp burned low and warm. The oaks outside stood enormous and still in the dark, and the boy breathed and the stars turned overhead. The weeks softened into months, and the boy grew the way things grow in good soil, steadily and without argument. He grew heavier, then he grew loud. The tent that had been quiet for so many decades became a place of small, urgent sounds, a demand for milk, a protest at the heat, a sudden laugh at nothing at all that startled the dogs into sitting up and looking around. Abraham could be heard speaking to him in the low, particular voice that men use with the very young, the words not mattering, only the sound and the nearness of it. When Isaac was old enough to sit propped against a rolled blanket, Sarah would carry him to the tent entrance in the early evening, and they would sit there together watching the flocks come in. The animals moved in a soft tide through the gate of the rope fence, copper-colored and pale and dark, their bells tapping a sleepy rhythm, their breath rising in the last of the cool air. Isaac watched all of it with the attentive gravity of the very young, who have not yet learned to look away from things. His eyes were wide and dark and calm. He learned to crawl in the shade of the great oaks, patting at the roots that lifted above the soil, and reaching for the small beetles that went about their business across the dry bark. The herdsman would detour past the oak just to watch, pleased in the way that the whole encampment was pleased. A child among tents is a different kind of wealth, and everyone in Abraham's household seemed to know it without needing to say so. By the time he took his first steps, two of the older women were positioned an arm's length from him at all times, saying nothing, ready. He discovered the sheep before he was fully steady on his feet. The ewes tolerated him with the enormous patience of sheep, who are accustomed to things bumping against them. He would walk into the flock's edge and stop there, surrounded by warm flanks and the thick lanolin smell of them, and not seem frightened at all, only interested, as if the sheep were a kind of weather he was learning. By the time he could run, he could also call them. He had the beginning of his father's low, particular voice. The shepherds laughed and looked at each other over his head. There came the day of the weaning feast, which the household had been preparing the way one prepares for a thing long hoped for. Bread had been baking since before dawn, the flat rounds on hot stones and the thicker loaves buried in ash. And someone had found honey, real honey in a clay jar stopped with beeswax, and there were figs dried on their stems, and roasted grains still warm from the pan, filling the air under the oaks with a smell of toasted sweetness. The women had laid rugs out in the shade and set the food out on low wooden boards. It looked, Abraham thought, like an ordinary abundance. But it was not ordinary. They gathered in the afternoon when the worst of the heat had passed, and the oaks threw their fullest shade across the rugs. The household came, all of them, the herdsmen in their plain tunics, the women who had watched through the night, the older servants who had walked all the road from Harran and remembered what that road had cost. Someone had brought a hand drum and another a small lyre, and the music began quietly, almost accidentally, the way music sometimes does. And people leaned in toward the sound, and the mood of the afternoon settled into something that needed no name. A boy ran between the trees. A dog stretched out in a patch of sun. Sarah sat at the center of it all, with Isaac in her lap and the honey jar within reach, and the look on her face of someone who has been given, after a very long time, exactly what they asked for. She tore small pieces of bread and dipped them in the honey and gave them to him, and he received each piece with full seriousness, tasting it, considering it, and then opening his mouth for the next. Abraham watched from just outside the circle. The afternoon light slanted through the oak branches. Someone was singing, a low, repetitive song that seemed to have been made for just this sort of day. The feast lasted into the evening, and the lamps were lit when the daylight failed. And people went on talking, and the boy went on eating honey bread until he fell asleep in Sarah's arms with a faint stickiness still on his chin. She did not move him for a long time. The fire in the cook-pit burned down to orange coals, and the oaks creaked once in the night breeze, and the stars appeared one by one above the treetops as they always did, punctual and unhurried. This was, the old story says, one of the glad days, uncomplicated and whole, and Abraham's household lay down that night well-fed and glad. Now we move gently south, following the tents as they are struck and loaded and set up again in the dry south country that the people of that land called the Negev. It is a different country from the oaks and limestone of Mamre, wider and paler, the ground chalk-colored between the tufts of gray-green scrub, the sky a hard blue that deepens toward violet at noon. The camel bells take on a flatter sound in such dry air. The flocks spread further from the wells. But the light is extraordinary, low and long and golden at morning and evening, so that even a stone looks like it has been placed there deliberately. In that country, Abraham settled for a season near a place where water could be dug from the ground, a well that had been fought over before and would be again if things were not put right. Word came that Abimelech, the neighboring king, wished to speak with him, not as an adversary, but as a man who had watched Abraham's years in that country and wished to make a peace between them. They met on open ground between the encampments, which is the old way of meeting when both parties wish to be honest about what they carry. Abraham came with 7 ewe lambs set apart in a small group, white and quiet, the morning light on their wool. The 7 ewe lambs were Abraham's gift and his sign. Let these be witness between us that I dug this well. It was the old way of making a thing certain. Not a contract written, but a living sign, something that grazed and ate and could be counted. Abimelech received them, and they spoke quietly together in the manner of 2 men who prefer to settle a thing once and not return to it. And before the sun reached its midpoint, a quiet oath had been sworn between them over the well, and the place was named Beersheba, the well of the oath, or some say the well of the 7, and the water in it was from that day a shared and peaceful thing. When Abimelech and his captain had gone back to their country along the pale track between the thorn scrub, Abraham stood for a while at the well's edge and looked into the water, which gave him back the sky and his own face, older than he thought of it, framed in the dark circle of the stones. Then he walked to the edge of the encampment and planted a young tamarisk tree, small, the roots balled in cloth, in the dry ground near the well. The tamarisk is a patient tree. It grows slowly and lives long and endures salt and drought with equal composure, and a man who plants one is making a promise to the future without needing to say so. Isaac grew up knowing that tree. He would have known it as a sapling barely taller than himself, and then as a thing he could sit beneath in the heat of the day, its fine, feathery branches giving a thin but real shade, its roots drawing some hidden moisture from the deep ground around the well. He would have watched the flocks watered at the stone rim. He would have seen the rope lowered and the jar brought up dripping, the water catching the light as it fell into the trough. A child who grows up near a well knows something about patience and depth that others learn later, if they learn it at all. The days in Beersheba had their own rhythm, different from Mamre's shade and stone, but easy in their own way. The goats went out early while the ground was still cool and came back before the worst of the heat, and the household kept the long midday hours inside the tents, with the flaps raised to let the air move through. In the late afternoon, a breeze came regularly off the higher ground to the north, and people came out and worked and talked, and the children ran in the long shadows. Isaac's small voice could be heard among the sheep. He had the beginning of a proper shepherd's call, and the animals were beginning to answer it. Abraham lived many quiet days in that dry south country, and the old story does not fill all of them with event, which is honest. Most of a life is not event, but accumulation, the slow layering of ordinary mornings and familiar sounds and the gradual knowledge of a place. He knew the well by the sound of the rope. He knew the season by the quality of the light on the chalk ground. He knew his son's voice among all the voices of the camp, and when he heard it, he felt something that had no name in any language he spoke, only the feeling itself, plain and entire. And so the tent stood in Beersheba, and the tamarisk put on another season of growth, and the well gave water, and the 7 ewe lambs grazed into the flock and could not be told apart from the others any more, and the promise that had been made quietly between 2 men over a stone rim held, as quiet promises sometimes do, not from being loudly kept, but from simply being true. The evening came on in the south country with a slowness that made it easy to sit and watch, the sky going from blue to gold to rose to the first faint gray of dusk, each color taking its time. The stars came out the way they always did, first 1 or 2 near the horizon, then the whole crowd of them overhead, and the night air lost the last of the day's heat and came in through the tent walls smelling of dry earth and thyme and the faint sweetness of the flock bedded down nearby. Abraham sat at his tent door for a while and said nothing, the way an old man sits who is not lonely but is simply resting in what his life has become. The boy was asleep inside. The tamarisk stood by the well in the dark. The stars were the same stars they had always been. The days at Beersheba settled into a quiet rhythm, bread baked on hot stones in the morning, the flock moving out at first light under a pale sky, the tamarisk casting its thin morning shadow across the mouth of the well. But in the way of households where 2 women have raised their hopes in the same space, a heaviness had been gathering slowly, the way a season turns, not with a single day's wind, but with many small ones. It came between them gently, and then not so gently, and the old man felt it like a stone set quietly in his chest. He carried it through several mornings without speaking, this weight that had to do with his son, his firstborn, the boy he had walked with in the early years of the promise, whose laughter he had heard before he heard Isaac's. It grieved him deeply, the old story says, for his son's sake. He could not see forward, and he could not hold both things at once. He sat by the tamarisk in the late afternoon when the shadows were long and the desert cooled. And the grief was plain in him, the way grief is plain in a man who has learned not to shout. And in the night, as the old story tells it, a quietness came to him. Not explanation, not argument, but something more like a hand set gently on a troubled thing. Do not be grieved for the boy. Listen, and let them go. I will keep the boy. From him too I will make a great people. The words settled into him the way water settles into dry ground, slowly, without sound. He lay still under the dark of the tent, and the stars moved above the roof flap as they always had. And by the time the first gray of morning came, he had made his peace, though it cost him something to make it. He rose in the early morning before the household woke, before the dew had gone from the sparse grass at the tent ropes, before the flock had stirred. He took bread, the round flat bread that had cooled through the night, and he took a skin of water, a good skin, full, the leather dark and swollen with the weight of it. He carried these things himself with his own hands, and brought them to Hagar, where she was already awake, already sitting, her face arranged with a stillness that told him she had known something was coming, and had prepared herself for it through the long night. The boy Ishmael was a young man now, or nearly, old enough to carry his own bow, old enough to track a wadi for water. Abraham placed the bread and the skin upon her shoulder, the old story says, and she took them without a word, and he put his hand briefly upon the boy's head, his firstborn, his son, and then he stepped back because it was the only thing left to do. The parting was not without sorrow. It was carried the way he had learned to carry many things on this long road, not by setting it down, but by walking forward with it, quietly, step by step. They went out into the wilderness of Beersheba, the dry south country, where the ground turns from pale limestone to pale sand, and the shrubs grow small and far apart, and the sky in the morning is enormous and the color of bone. Hagar walked with the boy beside her, and the settlement of Abraham fell behind them, the tents growing smaller and then gone, the tamarisk a thin line at the horizon and then nothing. The wilderness does not explain itself. It simply opens, and you walk into it, and the distance ahead is longer than the distance behind, and you keep walking. The sun moved higher, and the shade moved away, and the water in the skin grew less. They had walked since dawn, and the heat pressed down on the scrub and on the stones and on their shoulders, and the boy's strength was not what it had been in the cool of the morning. Thirst takes a young body differently than it takes the spirit. The legs first, then the quiet behind the eyes. He was tired and thirsty, the way a boy in the desert is tired and thirsty, which is very simply and without drama, the way a candle burns low. And Hagar saw it, and her heart clenched like a hand. She found a shrub, a low desert shrub, not much, but with enough spread of branch to lay a shadow across the ground, and she settled the boy there, in its shade. She arranged him gently, the way a mother does, and put what remained of the bread within his reach. Then she went and sat a little way off, a bowshot's distance perhaps, where the scrub was thin and the ground was just ground. She sat facing away, because she could not watch him suffer. Not from weakness, but from love, which sometimes turns its face away because it is too full to look. She wept, the old story says, with great weeping, and the story holds them there for a moment. The mother with her back turned, and her grief held quietly in her body, the boy in the thin shade of the shrub, the wilderness around them enormous and indifferent and dry. It holds them there, the way the desert holds everything, completely, without explanation. But the old story has not finished, because this is not where it ends. The old story is always moving towards something, even when everything looks still. Even in the wilderness of Beersheba, in the hottest part of a long day, with an empty water skin and a tired boy in the shade of a thorn bush. God heard the boy. That is what the old story says, simply, without ornament. God heard the boy, and a voice came to Hagar, not a figure, not a form, only a voice, the way a voice sometimes comes in the terrible quiet of a thing too hard to bear. Do not be afraid. Lift the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make of him a great people. The words came to her the way the words had come once before, years ago, at a spring in another wilderness, when she had been alone and afraid, and a voice had found her there. She was not a woman the wilderness forgot. She had been found before. She was found again. Her eyes were opened, and she saw a well of water. It was there, whether it had always been there just beyond the thorn bush, and she had not seen it in her grief, or whether it was given in that moment, the old story does not say, and it does not need to say. What matters is that it was there, and she saw it, and she rose. She went to it and filled the skin, the old dark leather swelling heavy and cool under her hands, and she brought it to the boy and gave him to drink. The sound of water going into a dry throat is one of the kindest sounds in the world. He drank, he lifted his head, he was well. They stayed by the well that day, and rested through the long afternoon, and slept when the stars came out and the desert cooled to something almost gentle. And over the days and weeks that followed, they made their way deeper into the wild south country, where the land opens into the Harran, a wide scrub desert of pale hills and dry wadis and long horizons that smell of dust and wild herbs in the evening. It was not the land of tents and flocks and careful waterskins that Hagar had known in Abraham's camp, but it was land. It was open. It had water if you knew where to look. And they were kept, and the boy grew. That is the plain and good thing the old story says next. The boy grew. He grew in the wilderness as a wild thing grows, not in spite of the open country, but because of it, shaped by the long distances and the clean air and the need to find water and read the sky. He became an archer, skilled and easy with the bow, moving through the scrub desert the way the desert creatures move, quietly, alertly, belonging to the land. His mother watched him become himself, and there is no tenderness in the old story quite like the tenderness of watching a child become who they were always going to be. Hagar kept her tent in the wild south country and kept her eye on her son the way a woman keeps watch over what she loves and has nearly lost, closely, quietly, without ever quite looking away. She was from Egypt, the old story remembers, and she had traveled very far from the Green River Valley and the reed banks and the water birds to find herself here in this pale and open land. But this land had seen her. This wilderness had heard her son's name spoken in mercy, and she did not forget it. She found a wife for him from among her own people, the old story says, a woman of Egypt, and the household was made, and the years began their growing. The promise over Ishmael stood. It had been spoken twice now, once at the spring in the wilderness where a young woman had fled alone and afraid, and once in the burning heat of a dry day in Beersheba, with an empty water skin and a tired boy in the shade of a shrub. Twice the voice had come. Twice his name had been spoken in the wilderness. Twice the well had been there. A great people, the voice had said, and the old story trusts those words without needing to count them yet. It sets them down quietly, the way you set a lamp in the window, not to command the dark, but to hold a light against it. And Abraham, far away in his tents at Beersheba, kept the boy in his heart. The old story does not say this in so many words, but it is there in the shape of what comes after, in the way a man who has given something precious away does not stop thinking of it. He had laid his hands on the boy's head in the gray of early morning and watched him walk away into the pale south country, and some part of him walked with them still. He planted his tamarisk and dug his wells and kept his covenant and his tent, and the years moved over him the way years do, slowly and without pause like the stars. 2 sons. two roads going out from the same tent, two promises moving forward into the world, one through the laughter of a child born in old age, one through the strength of a boy who had learned the wilderness and grown into it like a tree grows into stone. The old story carries them both gently and without rivalry, the way the sky carries both the morning star and the evening star, each in its own good season, each its own good light. The well in the wilderness kept its water, the boy kept growing, his mother kept watch, and the desert, which looks like it forgets, remembered everything. And so the years moved on, as years do in the desert, not in leaps, but in the slow accumulation of sunrises, of lambing seasons, of rains that came and rains that did not. Isaac grew at his mother's side, in the tents at Beersheba, near the tamarisk Abraham had planted, near the well of the oath. He was the child of the laughter, and he carried that lightness in him the way a jar carries water, quietly, without spilling. And the old man watched him grow with the particular tenderness of one who had waited a very long time. Then one night, the old story says it quietly, without preparation, a word came to Abraham in the dark, the way words from that deep place always came, not with thunder, not with spectacle, but with a stillness that filled every corner of the tent. The word asked of him the hardest trust he had yet been asked to carry. And the old man lay still for a moment, in the dark, with the stars outside and his son asleep not far away. Then, before the gray rim of dawn had fully formed, he rose. He rose early in the morning. That is what the old story says, and there is a steadiness in those words that the narration does not need to ornament. Simply, he rose early. He moved quietly through the sleeping camp. He saddled the donkey himself, his hands finding the familiar leather in the dark, the buckles cold with the last of the night's chill. He split the wood for the offering and tied it into a bundle. He woke Isaac, the child of the laughter, and two young men from his household, and they set out together into the lifting gray. The first day's road was long and ordinary in the way of desert roads, dust underfoot, the scrub sage silver in the morning air, the donkey's steady rhythm, the creak of the wood bundle shifting. The young men walked behind. Isaac walked beside his father, sometimes talking, sometimes quiet, the way a boy walks with a father he trusts entirely. The sun climbed, blazed, began to soften. They made camp where a dry waddy offered a little shelter from the wind, and the fire was built low, and they slept under the familiar weight of the stars. The second day unfolded in much the same way. The road, the light, the dry country opening and folding in its limestone terraces. Wild rock hyraxes watched from their ledges. A pair of eagles rode the afternoon thermals overhead, turning in slow, patient circles. The donkey found its footing on the stony path without being led. Isaac gathered a handful of small white stones and let them fall one by one as he walked, the way children do when the journey is long and the world is still new enough to be worth measuring in small handfuls. They camped again beneath the open sky. On the third day in the morning, Abraham lifted his eyes, and there it was, a mountain, rising clear against the pale sky, still far off but unmistakable in the way certain things are unmistakable, the way a lamp is unmistakable in a dark room. He stilled for a moment. Then he turned to the two young men and told them, gently and without explanation, to remain there with the donkey. He and the boy would go on ahead and return, and he laid the wood bundle on Isaac's shoulders, and he himself carried the fire, the coals in their clay vessel, warm against his ribs, and they walked on together. They walked on together. The path climbed, the scrub thinned, the limestone showed itself pale and warm in the morning sun, and the air was clean with the smell of thyme crushed underfoot. And then Isaac spoke, with the careful noticing of a boy who has been taught to pay attention to the world. He said, "Father," and Abraham said, "Here I am, my son." And Isaac said, "We have the fire and we have the wood, but where is the lamb for the offering?" And Abraham, without breaking his step, said, "God will provide the lamb, my son," and they walked on together. The words rested between them as words sometimes do, not answered, not pressed, but held, the way a valley holds the morning mist before the sun lifts it. God will provide the lamb. The boy received it and walked on. The father carried it and walked on. The path wound between old outcroppings of stone, and somewhere to the east a dove called once and fell silent. The mountain grew larger with each turning of the path, its top rimmed with the clear early light. And they were together on that road, the old man and the boy, moving forward without haste and at peace. When they reached the place, the morning light lay full across it, warm and plain. Abraham set down the coals. He found the stones, rough field stones, unworked, the kind that fit together under a patient hand. He built the altar slowly, placing stone on stone with care, the way a man builds something meant to last. The boy helped, perhaps, handing a stone when one was needed. The wood was laid in order across it, each piece placed deliberately, the bundle undone and sorted with quiet hands. The mountain was still around them, and the sky above was very wide and very clear. And Abraham made everything ready, slowly and gently, as one who trusts. The morning was still. A small wind moved across the mountain's shoulder and passed. The old man's hands were steady. He had carried this moment through 3 days of walking and 2 nights under the stars, and he had not put it down, and he had not looked away from it, and he had not ceased to trust the one who had brought him all this long road from the city by the river to this quiet height. Everything was ready. The wood lay in its order, the altar stood. Then, gently, sudden, and kind, the way the first light of morning arrives before you have quite seen it come, a voice. Not a figure, not a face, only a voice, like light-given sound, like the moment when the sky changes. "Do not reach out your hand against the boy. Now I know." The words fell on the mountain the way rain falls on dry ground, quietly absorbed, complete. The old man's hands stilled. The morning held its breath for a single open moment. And Abraham lifted his eyes, and there, caught by its horns in a thicket of bramble at the mountain's edge, was a ram. It stood in the tangle of branches, its curved horns held fast, patient as though it had been waiting there for exactly this moment. The old man went to it. His heart, which had been so steady and so heavy all this long way, was now light in a way that had no name. He took the ram and offered it instead, there on the altar in the morning smoke. And he called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide." The smoke rose straight in the still mountain air. And here, once and lightly, the old story pauses to say what the whole long road had quietly been saying. The one who had called him out under the stars had provided and was with him still. The mountain was named for that. And in the naming it became what mountains sometimes become. Not only a place on a map of the ancient world, but a word the heart reaches for when trust is required and the outcome cannot be seen. But the narration does not press this. It lets the smoke rise and moves on. And then, this is the part the old story holds most tenderly. They went down the mountain together. The father and his son, Isaac, the child of the laughter, going down the limestone path as the morning grew warm around them. The shadows of the morning shortened. The time came back under their feet, and the scent of it came back too. And somewhere on a lower terrace, the donkey lifted its head at their returning footsteps. The 2 young men saw them coming from far off. 2 figures on the path, walking steadily, the older and the younger, together. They came down to where the young men waited, and they all set out together on the road back south toward Beersheba. The road home is always different from the road out, shorter somehow, or lighter, even when the feet are tired. The same limestone country, the same scrub and dust and afternoon thermals, but the air carried something it had not carried on the way up. A promissory warmth. Over them, as they walked, The old story says the promise was renewed like morning light over the hills, descendants beyond counting, like the stars of the heavens, like the sand at the edge of the sea. The old man walked with his son on that homeward road and did not speak much, the way people sometimes do not speak after something large has passed through them. Not because words are gone, but because silence is the only space large enough to hold what has happened. The donkey's hooves kept their steady rhythm on the stone. The young men walked behind. Isaac walked beside his father, easy and close, the way he always had. The country they passed through was the same country, but they moved through it as people who have been to a high place and come back changed in ways they could not yet name. Evening came as it does in the desert, quickly, as though the sky has been waiting all day to put on its best colors. The road ahead turned a shade of copper in the last light. They were still walking. The stars were beginning, one by one, in the east, where the sky had already gone deep and dark and private. And Abraham looked up at them. These stars he had been looking at for so many years, the ones that were a promise, the ones he had tried to count in Harran when everything began. And they were still there, exactly where they had always been. They came back to Beersheba, the well of the oath, the tamarisk, the black tents of home. And the tents received them as tents always receive travelers, with the smell of wood smoke and the warmth of a known place. Sarah would have been at the entrance, perhaps, watching the road south in the way she always watched. And the lamps were lit, and bread was made, and the boy ate with the appetite of one who has walked 3 days through the hill country and back. The old man sat a little apart, near the door, watching the familiar stars arrange themselves above the tamarisk. The night settled over Beersheba softly as it had settled over so many of their nights, over the river city of Ur long ago, over the tents of Harran, over the road through Canaan, over Egypt's green valley, over the oaks of Mamre, over every camp they had ever made in 50 years of following a road that was given one step at a time. The tents held the lamplight. The well held its water. The tamarisk held its branches over the old man's head and made a small, patient sound in the night wind. Isaac was asleep inside, the child of the laughter given back. And the old man, sitting at the tent door in the late dark, with the coals of the evening fire gone gray and the stars overhead as numerous as they had ever been, breathed in the night air of the south country, dry and cool, and faintly scented with the sage that grew in the pale wadi below the camp. The mountain was behind him now, 3 days' walk to the north. The ram was behind him. The voice like light was behind him. And what was before him was this quiet, this dark, this particular scattering of stars, and a sleeping boy, and the road that would keep going, and all of it given back, and all of it enough. We leave him there for a moment, at the door, under the stars, with the road behind him and the road still ahead. The well of the oath stands quiet in the dark. The tamarisk breathes its small sound. Everything that was asked of him on the mountain has been returned to him, and the night holds it all without effort, the way the desert holds the last warmth of the day long after the sun is gone. Isaac sleeps. The old man watches the stars. The lamp at the tent door burns low and steady, as it has burned through so many of their long, quiet nights in this ancient and patient land. The years came and went over the tents at Mamre, the way seasons come over open country, unhurried, one following another in their order, each one leaving the land a little softer than it found it. Sarah had laughed once, a long time ago, in disbelief. She had laughed again in wonder when the child was laid in her arms. And for all the years between that first startled laughter and the last quiet evening of her life, she had been the heart of the tent, the warmth at its center, the one whose voice made a dwelling place of any ground they set their stakes in. Her years were full, 127 of them, each one lived without waste. And when they were complete, she was gathered gently to rest, the way a long day gathers itself into dusk, without fuss, without argument, as though it had always meant to end just so. She died at Hebron, in the hill country, under the shade of old trees, and the old man, who had walked beside her from Harran to here, from that first road to this last quiet place, sat with his grief as a man sits with something very large and very loved, in silence. He rose then and went to find her a resting place, not a borrowed field, not a stranger's ground, a place of his own, truly his own, in the land he had been walking through all his life. He came to the people of Hebron and sat with them at the gate, as the custom was, the old formal place where agreements were made in the open, witnessed by all who passed. He was a stranger and a sojourner among them, he said. He had always known it, and yet he asked courteously if they would sell him a place to bury his dead. The old story tells it with a patience that honors the moment. The courteous back and forth at the gate, the offer made, the full price weighed out in silver without reduction, without debt, without gift that might one day be called back. The field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, with its cave and all the trees standing in it and all the ground around it, this he purchased, complete, in the hearing of all the people of the town. And so the man of tents, the sojourner all his life, owned at last one quiet green field in the promised land. He had always carried it lightly. Now at last the land held him. He laid her there, in the cave of the field of Machpelah among the trees. The ground was dappled and still, the way old ground is that has been kept by shade for a long time. There were oaks and broad terebinths, those wide shade trees that are kin to the oak, and the air between them was cool even in the heat of the day. She rested among them, and the field was his, and it was enough. It was the first ground he had ever owned in all the long journey. And it was the right ground, a garden of a place, patient and green, waiting to hold what mattered most. Time moved on, as it does, with its particular mercy. Isaac grew into himself, a quiet man, given to evening walks in the open country, given to stillness, to the inner weather of thought. His mother's absence sat in him like a room with a closed door. And so the old man did what old fathers do when they have walked long enough to know what a person needs. He sent a trusted servant, his oldest and most faithful, back to the far country, back toward Harran and the old kin, to find a wife for the son of laughter from among the people of the first road. The loveliest image of it is the arrival. The servant had gone out in faith and returned in faith, and with him came camels laden with the careful things of a journey well done, and among the travelers a young woman veiled against the road's dust, riding the long last miles as evening opened over the Negev like a hand laid open. Isaac was out in the fields at dusk walking as was his way, and he looked up and saw the camels coming, and she looked up and saw him. And the story says she alighted from her camel and covered her face gently, and they were brought together, and she came into his mother's tent. The tent that had been Sarah's held warmth again. Isaac was comforted. The child of laughter was glad once more, in the way that gladness returns to a person who had thought it finished. Not loudly, not with fanfare, but like the first morning after a long rain, when the ground smells of itself again and the light falls clean and the birds begin. The old man at his own tent door heard the sound of it, a young wife's laughter somewhere among the encampment, the smell of bread, the ordinary music of a household beginning, and he was glad in his old bones all the way down. The last years of Abraham were lived like a long exhale, slowly, fully, without hurry. The flocks were tended by other hands now. The journeys were done. He sat at his tent door in the mornings and watched the light come over the limestone ridges, the way he had watched it rise over so many different horizons in so many different countries across so many years. The hills of Mamre were familiar to him now, the way a face becomes familiar, not merely recognized, but known, deeply known, the small variations of its seasons understood, its moods of cloud and clarity mapped somewhere below thought. There were grandchildren now, small voices among the tents, the sound of running feet on dry ground, the particular chaos of the very young who do not yet know that the world is large and demanding and will one day ask much of them. For now they only ran and called out and were fed, and their small laughter echoed under the oaks the way birdsong echoes, thoughtless, bright, entirely itself. The old man heard it and said nothing, and needed to say nothing. It was enough to sit in the sound of it, the way the land sits in rain, receiving, still grateful in its silence. At evening, he would look at the stars, not with urgency, not as a man reading a promise not yet arrived, but as a man who has watched long enough to know the promise kept, and who looks now simply because they are beautiful, because they are the same stars, because they were there before the road began and will be there long after. And there is comfort in that oldness, in that permanence, in the way the sky does not change even when everything below it does. The stars he had been shown over Harran, countless, unhurried, were still all there. Every one of them. Still there. He had planted a tamarisk once at Beersheba, the well of the oath where the dry south country opens into pale scrub, and by now it would be large. He had built altars of rough, unworked stone at Shechem, at Bethel, at Mamre, at places whose names he had been the first to give. He had dug wells and named them. He had walked paths that became roads because he walked them. The land was marked by the quiet passing of him through it, the way a long river marks its valley, not by force but by the patient, faithful pressure of its going. He was full of years. The old story uses that phrase with such tenderness, full as a vessel is full, as a day is full, that has been lived all the way through to its last light. There was nothing missing. The road had asked much of him across a long lifetime, and he had given what was asked, and what had been promised had come, not all at once, never all at once, but steadily, in the way that the seasons bring what they bring, each in its time. He lay down in the way that a man lies down when he has finished a thing well, without complaint, without reaching back, in peace. And his 2 sons came. Isaac came from the south country, from the tent that had been his mother's and was now his own. And Ishmael came, the elder son, the firstborn, the one the wilderness had held, and the one whom God had heard crying in the dry place, the one over whom a great people had been promised and whose life had been large and free and his own. Both came. They stood together at the field of Machpelah, at the cave among the trees, and they laid their father to rest beside Sarah, the 2 of them side by side as sons. The one who had called him out under the stars, out of Ur by the river, out of Harran and its comfort, out into the long uncharted road, had been with him all the way home. The road is over now. The tents are quiet, the stars are all still there, and it is enough now to rest. Somewhere among the tents, a lamp still glows. The camels have folded their long legs in the dust by the well, the way they always do at the end of a journey, patient and enormous and content. The flocks are folded. The bread is eaten. The night is warm and smells of thyme and the last cook fire cooling. Overhead, the sky is enormous and unhurried, thick with the old light of 10,000 stars, the same stars that were shown to him all those years and all those roads ago, when the promise was young and the land was still ahead and everything was yet to come. They have not moved. They do not move. They simply shine, as they have always shone, over the sleeping tents of the earth. On a pale hillside nearby, where a rough stone altar stands from an older day, the last thread of smoke from the day's offering lifts and stills and is gone into the first stars. The stone is cold now. The offering was enough. The hillside is quiet and asks nothing more of the night. The wide highlands of Canaan go blue and deep in the last of the light. The terraced hills, the old olive groves, the limestone ridges softening into dusk, the long patient land that held a man's whole life and asked only that he walk it faithfully. It is holding still, it will hold. The lamp at the tent door burns low and gutters and is still. And so the lamp burns low on the story of Abraham. Thank you for resting with us tonight. Until our next story, Lullaby Atlas. Sleep well.